Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the treacherous shadows of one of America's most haunting landmarks with 8 disturbing true accounts from the mysterious Skull Cliff region of the Grand Canyon. Each story we explore today has been meticulously documented from the personal testimonies of park rangers, hikers, researchers, and emergency responders who experienced the unexplainable terror that lurks within these ancient stone walls. These are not mere legends passed down through generations, but raw confessions from individuals whose lives were forever changed by what they witnessed in the depths of this cursed canyon territory. From photographers capturing images that should not exist to rescue workers discovering things that defy rational explanation. Tonight we uncover the buried truth about why certain areas of the Grand Canyon remain restricted to the public. To protect the identity and privacy of those brave enough to share their experiences, some names and specific locations have been carefully altered while preserving the terrifying reality of their encounters. If you are new to Buried Files, make sure to subscribe for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning what lies hidden in the shadows of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth the next collection of forgotten nightmares. Drop a comment below and tell us about any unexplained experiences you have had in national parks or remote locations. I have been a professional landscape photographer for 15 years, but I have never shown anyone the last photos on my camera from that trip to Skull Cliff. My name is Marcus D'Angelo, and I have traveled across Arizona documenting the raw beauty of our desert landscapes for magazines like Southwest Living and National Geographic. I thought I had seen every angle, every hidden corner of the Grand Canyon region until that assignment in late October changed everything I believed about the places we think we know. The assignment came through my usual contact at Arizona Highways magazine. They wanted a winter feature on the lesser-known areas of the Grand Canyon, specifically focusing on the remote cliff formations that most tourists never see. The pay was excellent, and they gave me complete creative freedom. I had 3 days to capture 20 publishable shots of the Skull Cliff area, a section of the canyon that gets its name from the bone-white limestone formations that jut out like ancient vertebrae along the southern rim. I had researched the area extensively before making the trip. Skull Cliff sits about 40 miles from the main tourist areas, accessible only by a rough dirt road that requires 4-wheel drive and local knowledge to navigate safely. The geological surveys I found mentioned unusual mineral deposits in the rock face that create distinctive color patterns during different lighting conditions. What they did not mention were the strange reports from park rangers about equipment malfunctions and unexplained phenomena in that specific region. I loaded my truck with enough gear for a week-long expedition, even though I only planned to stay 3 days. My equipment included 2 Canon cameras, multiple lenses ranging from wide-angle to telephoto, a heavy-duty tripod, lighting equipment, backup batteries, and enough memory cards to shoot thousands of images. I also packed camping gear, food, water, and emergency supplies because cell phone coverage in that area was non-existent, and help was hours away if something went wrong. The drive to Skull Cliff took nearly 6 hours from Phoenix, with the last 2 hours on increasingly rough terrain that tested both my truck and my determination. When I finally reached my planned campsite, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the canyon walls. The limestone formations really did look like massive skulls emerging from the earth, and I immediately understood why early settlers had given the area such an ominous name. I set up camp quickly and prepared my equipment for the golden hour photography that would begin at dawn. The silence out there was absolute, broken only by occasional wind through the rock formations. I had photographed in remote locations before, but something about Skull Cliff felt different from the moment I arrived. The air seemed thicker somehow, and every sound I made seemed to echo longer than it should have. The first day of shooting went perfectly. I captured stunning images of the sunrise illuminating the cliff face, revealing layers of geological history and the striations of rock. The limestone formations created natural frames for shots of the canyon beyond, and the morning light brought out colors I had never seen in other desert locations. My cameras performed flawlessly, and by noon I had already captured enough quality images to satisfy the magazine assignment. That afternoon I decided to explore deeper into the cliff area to find unique angles for sunset shots. I discovered a narrow ledge about halfway up the main formation that offered an incredible panoramic view of the canyon system. Getting there required some technical climbing, but I had brought rope and safety equipment for exactly these kinds of opportunities. The perspective from that ledge was extraordinary, and I knew the sunset shots would be the highlight of my entire portfolio. As evening approached, I positioned myself on the ledge with my primary camera mounted on the tripod. The light was perfect, and I began shooting as the sun descended toward the horizon. Through my viewfinder, everything looked normal. The canyon spread out below me in all its massive beauty. The rock formations glowed with warm light, and the sky began its transformation through the spectrum of sunset colors. But when I reviewed the images on my camera's display screen, I saw things that had not been visible to my naked eye. In the first few shots, there were dark shapes moving along the canyon floor far below. The shapes were too large to be animals and too organized in their movement to be shadows from passing clouds. They appeared to be human figures, but the scale was wrong. If they were people, they would have had to be at least 12 feet tall to be visible from my position at that distance. I checked my camera settings, thinking I might have accidentally created a double exposure or some other technical error. Everything was correct. I looked down at the canyon floor again, scanning carefully for any sign of movement. I saw nothing but empty desert and rock, but when I took another series of shots and reviewed them immediately, the dark figures were still there, now closer to the base of Skull Cliff directly below my position. The rational part of my mind tried to find logical explanations. Maybe atmospheric conditions were creating some kind of optical illusion that the camera sensor was picking up differently than my eyes. Maybe heat distortion was causing distant objects to appear larger than they actually were. Maybe shadows from the complex rock formations were combining in ways that created the appearance of moving figures. But as I continued shooting, the figures became more distinct and obviously intentional in their movements. They appeared to be climbing up the cliff face below me, though I could see no climbing routes or equipment that would make such an ascent possible. The rock face beneath my ledge was nearly vertical and offered no handholds that I could detect. Yet the dark shapes continued upward, growing larger in each successive photograph. I switched to my telephoto lens to get a closer look at whatever was creating these images. When I zoomed in on the area where the figures appeared to be, I saw details that made my hands shake. The shapes had human-like forms but wrong proportions. Their limbs were too long, their torsos too narrow, and their movements too fluid for normal human anatomy. They climbed the cliff face like spiders, clinging to surfaces that should not have supported any weight. The sun was almost completely set by this point, but I continued taking photographs compulsively. Each image showed the figures getting closer to my position. In the growing darkness, I could finally see them with my own eyes as they approached. They were not human, though they had once been human-shaped. Their skin was the same bone-white color as the limestone cliffs, and their eyes reflected the last rays of sunlight like an animal's eyes in headlights. I had no rational explanation for what I was witnessing. These beings, whatever they were, existed in a way that my camera could detect before my eyes could see them clearly. They moved with purpose and intelligence, and they were definitely climbing toward my ledge. I packed my equipment as quickly as possible, but my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my primary camera twice. The rappel down from the ledge was the most terrifying few minutes of my life. I could hear movement on the rock face around me, the sound of fingernails or claws scraping against stone. But every time I looked toward the sounds, I saw nothing but empty cliff face. My camera, hanging from its strap around my neck, continued to fire automatically as I descended, the flash illuminating the darkness in brief bursts. I reached the bottom of the cliff and ran toward my campsite without looking back. My equipment was scattered and disorganized as I threw everything into my truck, but I did not care about organization or proper packing procedures. I just wanted to get away from Skull Cliff as quickly as possible. The drive back to the main road took place in complete darkness, and I stopped frequently to check my mirrors for signs of pursuit, though I had no idea what I was expecting to see. When I reached civilization and reviewed all the photographs from that evening, I found a complete visual record of my encounter. The images showed the pale beings climbing steadily upward through the growing darkness. The final photographs, taken automatically as I rappelled down, showed dozens of them emerging from cracks and crevices all along the cliff face. They had been watching me the entire time I was up there. I never submitted those photographs to Arizona Highways magazine. Instead, I sent them a selection of the normal landscape shots from earlier in the day and made up a story about equipment problems that prevented me from getting the sunset shots they had requested. The editor was disappointed but accepted the daytime images, which were technically excellent and met their needs for the article. I have never returned to Skull Cliff, and I have never photographed in any remote area of the Grand Canyon region since that trip. The camera that captured those images is locked in a safe deposit box along with the memory cards containing the full sequence of photographs. I know that someday someone will find them and wonder what they are looking at, but I hope that day does not come for many years. The experience changed my entire relationship with photography and with the natural world. I realized that my cameras were capable of seeing things that remained invisible to human perception, and I was not prepared for that level of reality. There are places in this world where the boundary between what we think we know and what actually exists becomes dangerously thin. I still work as a photographer, but now I specialize in urban architecture and commercial photography. I take assignments that keep me in populated areas where strange encounters are unlikely and where help is always nearby if something goes wrong. My colleagues think I burned out on landscape photography or lost my passion for the wilderness, but the truth is much more complicated than professional burnout. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about those pale beings climbing steadily up the cliff face toward my position. I wonder if they are still there, waiting in the cracks and shadows of Skull Cliff for the next photographer or hiker who ventures too far from the established trails. I wonder if my presence there awakened something that had been sleeping in the limestone depths, or if I simply became aware of something that has always been active in that remote corner of the Grand Canyon. What disturbs me most is not knowing whether my camera revealed something that was actually there, or whether the act of photographing that location somehow created the very phenomena I documented. Modern digital cameras are incredibly sophisticated instruments capable of detecting electromagnetic radiation across a broader spectrum than human eyes can perceive. It is possible that my equipment was recording entities that exist in wavelengths of light invisible to normal human vision. But it is also possible that the repeated act of photographing that location created some kind of resonance or disturbance that attracted attention from things that normally remain hidden. Indigenous peoples throughout the Southwest have traditional stories about places where the spirits of the earth should not be disturbed by modern technology. And I have begun to wonder if I stumbled into one of those sacred and dangerous locations. The photographs remain locked away, serving as evidence of an encounter I never intended to have and can never fully explain. They are too clear and detailed to dismiss as technical malfunctions, too consistent across multiple images to explain as coincidental shadows or optical illusions. They document something that challenged everything I thought I understood about the natural world and about the limitations of human perception. I have told this story to no one until now, and I expect that most people will find it difficult to believe. But I know what I saw through my viewfinder that evening at Skull Cliff. And I know what my cameras recorded during those terrifying hours. There are places in this world where our technology reveals more than we are prepared to understand, and sometimes the truth is more disturbing than any fiction we could imagine. I volunteer for Grand Canyon Search and Rescue because I believe everyone deserves to come home. But some people at Skull Cliff do not want to be found. My name is Dakota Williams, and I have been part of the Coconino County Search and Rescue Team for 8 years. I have participated in over 200 rescue operations throughout Arizona, from flash flood evacuations to technical rope rescues on vertical cliff faces. But the mission that took place at Skull Cliff last January changed my understanding of what we are really searching for when people disappear in the wilderness. The initial call came through our emergency dispatch system at approximately 4 in the morning on a Tuesday. 2 separate groups of hikers had reported seeing distress signals from the Skull Cliff area the previous evening, including what appeared to be flashlight signals in a pattern that indicated someone was trying to communicate for help. The signals had been observed between 8 and 10 o'clock at night, coming from a location high on the cliff face that should not have been accessible to recreational hikers without specialized climbing equipment. Our team leader, Captain Sarah Mitchell, assembled a full technical rescue squad consisting of 6 experienced volunteers and 2 professional paramedics. The terrain at Skull Cliff requires advanced rope work and high-angle rescue techniques, so we loaded our vehicles with complete climbing systems, medical equipment, communications gear, and enough supplies for an extended operation. The weather forecast called for clear conditions with temperatures dropping below freezing after sunset, which meant that anyone stranded on the cliff face would be facing life-threatening exposure. The drive to Skull Cliff took nearly 3 hours because we had to transport heavy rescue equipment over rough terrain that tested the limits of our 4-wheel drive vehicles. We established our base camp at the bottom of the main cliff formation and began our assessment of the rescue situation using binoculars and telephoto cameras to scan the cliff face for signs of stranded hikers. The limestone cliffs rose nearly 400 feet above us with multiple ledges and fractures that could potentially shelter someone who had become trapped during a climbing attempt. Using our high-powered spotlights and electronic megaphones, we attempted to make contact with anyone who might be on the cliff face. We followed standard search and rescue protocols, calling out at regular intervals and listening for responses that would help us locate the position of anyone requiring assistance. The echoes from our voices bounced off the limestone walls in complex patterns that made it difficult to determine the direction of any potential responses. But we thought we heard faint calls for help coming from somewhere high on the cliff face. Captain Mitchell deployed our technical climbing team to begin ascending the cliff face using established anchor points and safety systems. I was part of the advanced team that would locate and assess the condition of any stranded hikers before the paramedics and additional rescue personnel were brought up to provide medical assistance and evacuation support. The climb to the first major ledge system took nearly 2 hours because we had to place protection anchors and establish safe belay stations as we ascended. When we reached the first ledge, approximately 150 feet up the cliff face, we found evidence that people had recently been in that location. There were scuff marks on the rock surface that indicated foot traffic, and we discovered several pieces of climbing equipment, including carabiners, webbing, and a partially used rope that appeared to have been cut rather than broken under load. The equipment was standard climbing gear, but it had been abandoned in a way that suggested emergency or panic rather than planned retreat. But there were no people on the ledge and no obvious signs of injury or distress that would explain why climbing equipment had been left behind. We used our radio communications to report our findings to the base camp team and continued our ascent toward the higher ledge systems where the distress signals had been observed. The limestone rock was solid and offered good handholds, but the exposure was significant, and the consequences of a fall would be fatal. As we climbed higher on the cliff face, we began to notice unusual characteristics in the rock formations that did not match the geological descriptions in our area maps. There were cavities and openings in the limestone that appeared to be natural caves or passages extending deep into the cliff structure. Some of these openings were large enough for human passage, and they showed evidence of recent use, including footprints in the accumulated dust and debris. The most significant discovery came when we reached the main ledge system approximately 250 feet above the canyon floor. We found a complete campsite including sleeping bags, backpacks, food supplies, and personal belongings that clearly belonged to multiple people. But the campsite appeared to have been abandoned hastily, with gear scattered and personal items left behind in ways that indicated sudden departure rather than planned evacuation. Among the abandoned belongings, we found identification documents belonging to 3 different individuals: Michael Torres from Phoenix, Jennifer Adams from Flagstaff, and Robert Kim from Tucson. According to the dates on their permits and camping receipts, these individuals had been in the area for at least 4 days, which meant they had been camping on the cliff ledge much longer than would be safe or legal without proper permits for extended stays in wilderness areas. But the most disturbing aspect of the campsite discovery was that the sleeping bags and personal belongings showed no signs of struggle or violence, yet the occupants had clearly left in extreme haste. Food was still in cooking pots, personal hygiene items were scattered as if people had been interrupted during normal camp activities, and valuable equipment, including expensive cameras and GPS devices, had been left behind. No experienced backpacker would abandon such equipment unless facing immediate life-threatening danger. We used our radio communications to relay the names and identification information to our base camp team for verification with missing persons databases and Park Service records. While waiting for that information, we continued our search of the ledge area and discovered something that made no sense within the context of a normal rescue operation. We found additional climbing equipment and personal belongings that appeared to belong to different groups of people from different time periods. Some of the abandoned gear showed signs of extended weathering and appeared to have been on the ledge for months or possibly years. There were pieces of clothing, camping equipment, and personal items that represented multiple separate groups of hikers or climbers who had apparently reached this same ledge and then disappeared, leaving their belongings behind. The accumulation of abandoned equipment suggested a pattern of disappearances that had been occurring over an extended period. Captain Mitchell joined our advance team on the ledge and immediately recognized that we were dealing with something far more complex than a routine rescue operation. The evidence suggested multiple groups of missing persons rather than a single emergency, and the pattern of abandoned equipment indicated that people had been reaching this location and then vanishing without explanation. She made the decision to expand our search into the cave openings and passages that we had discovered in the cliff face. The largest cave opening was located at the back of the main ledge and extended horizontally into the limestone cliff for an unknown distance. Using our headlamps and flashlights, we could see that the passage continued beyond the range of our lights and appeared to be a natural tunnel system within the cliff structure. There were definite signs that people had entered this cave system, including footprints, rope marks on the cave walls, and pieces of climbing equipment scattered along the entrance passage. Against standard search and rescue protocols, I volunteered to enter the cave system to search for the missing hikers. Captain Mitchell was reluctant to approve cave exploration without proper spelunking equipment and additional safety personnel, but the evidence clearly indicated that the missing people had gone into the cave passages, and we had an obligation to attempt rescue if they were trapped underground. The cave passage extended much deeper into the cliff than our preliminary examination had suggested. After crawling and climbing through the limestone tunnel for approximately 100 yards, I emerged into a large underground chamber that appeared to be a natural cavern within the cliff structure. My flashlight illuminated a space that was roughly the size of a small auditorium, with a high ceiling that disappeared beyond the reach of my light beam. But the most shocking discovery in the underground chamber was that it contained evidence of long-term human habitation. There were sleeping areas, food storage, water collection systems, and personal belongings that indicated multiple people had been living in the cave for extended periods. The sleeping areas appeared to be occupied, with personal belongings arranged as if the inhabitants had stepped away temporarily and intended to return. More disturbing was the discovery that some of the personal belongings in the cave matched the identification documents we had found in the abandoned campsite on the ledge. Michael Torres, Jennifer Adams, and Robert Kim appeared to have been living in the underground chamber, along with several other individuals whose belongings suggested they had been there much longer. There were personal items dating back months or possibly years, indicating a community of people who had chosen or been compelled to remain in the cave system. But there were no people in the underground chamber when I explored it. The sleeping areas appeared recently used. Food supplies were fresh, and there were signs of ongoing habitation, but the cave was completely empty of human occupants. It was as if an entire community of people had suddenly vanished from their underground refuge, leaving behind all their possessions and survival infrastructure. Using my radio communications, I reported the cave discoveries to Captain Mitchell and requested additional team members to help with the expanded search operation. But as I was preparing to return through the cave passage to the main ledge, I heard sounds that indicated people moving deeper within the cave system. There were voices echoing from passages that led further into the cliff structure, and the voices seemed to be calling for help or trying to communicate. I made the decision to investigate the source of the voices, following additional cave passages that led deeper into the limestone cliff. The passages were narrow and required technical climbing skills to navigate safely, but I could hear the voices becoming clearer as I moved deeper into the cave system. The voices were definitely human, and they seemed to be calling specific names, including some that matched the identification documents we had discovered. But as I got closer to the source of the voices, I began to realize that something was fundamentally wrong with what I was hearing. The voices were calling for help and trying to communicate, but they were also repeating the same phrases and names in patterns that seemed artificial or recorded. The voices lacked the emotional variation and spontaneous quality of people genuinely calling for help, and they seemed designed to lure searchers deeper into the cave system. When I finally reached the area where the voices seemed to originate, I found another large underground chamber that contained no people at all. The voices continued to echo through the space, but there was no source for the sounds that I could identify. The chamber contained more evidence of human habitation, including fresh food supplies and recently used sleeping areas, but it was completely empty of actual human occupants. At that point, I made the decision to retreat immediately back toward the cave entrance and rejoin the main rescue team. But as I was navigating back through the cave passages, I heard new voices behind me that seemed to be following my progress through the tunnel system. The voices were calling my name and asking me to wait or come back. But I had never introduced myself to anyone in the caves, and there was no way that anyone I had not encountered could know my identity. I emerged from the cave system onto the main ledge where Captain Mitchell and the rest of the rescue team were waiting for my report. When I described what I had found in the underground chambers, the team made the immediate decision to evacuate from the cliff face and return to base camp. The evidence we had discovered indicated a situation that exceeded the scope of normal search and rescue operations and required investigation by law enforcement and Park Service authorities. The official incident report documented the discovery of abandoned equipment and evidence of missing persons, but it did not include detailed descriptions of the underground chambers or the community infrastructure we had found in the cave system. The case was referred to the National Park Service for investigation as potential missing persons cases, and the Skull Cliff area was temporarily restricted to prevent additional hikers from accessing the dangerous cliff face. But over the following months, I began to experience persistent dreams and intrusive thoughts related to the voices I had heard in the cave system. The voices seemed to be calling for me to return to the underground chambers, and they provided detailed information about passages and locations within the cave system that I had not fully explored during my initial search. The dreams were so vivid and consistent that I began to question whether my experience in the caves had been entirely real. 6 months after the rescue operation, I learned that 2 other members of our search team had requested transfers to different rescue units and had stopped participating in operations at remote wilderness locations. When I contacted them privately, they admitted to experiencing similar dreams and intrusive thoughts related to the voices from the Skull Cliff caves, and they expressed concerns about the psychological effects of our experience during the rescue operation. I have not returned to Skull Cliff since that January rescue mission, and I now limit my search and rescue activities to locations that do not involve cave systems or underground exploration. The evidence we discovered during that operation suggested that people who disappear in the wilderness do not always want to be found, and that some missing persons cases involve circumstances that fall outside our understanding of normal human behavior. The voices I heard in those limestone caves were calling for help, but they were also calling for something else that I did not understand and did not want to investigate further. There are places in the wilderness where search and rescue operations become something more dangerous than emergency response, and Skull Cliff appears to be one of those places where the people we are searching for may not be the people we ultimately find. Our professor always warned us about staying on designated paths during field studies, but when we found those bone fragments embedded in the cliff face, scientific curiosity overrode common sense. My name is Benjamin Rivera, and I am a graduate student in geological sciences at the University of Arizona. What happened during our field trip to Skull Cliff in December has changed my entire understanding of what lies beneath the surface of our planet, and why some discoveries should remain buried in the depths where they have rested for millennia. The field trip was part of our advanced stratigraphy course, led by Dr. Patricia Hendricks, who has been studying Grand Canyon geology for over 30 years. Our group consisted of 6 graduate students and 2 undergraduate geology majors who had earned spots through exceptional academic performance. The purpose of our expedition was to conduct hands-on analysis of the limestone formations at Skull Cliff, examining mineral deposits and sedimentary layers that represent millions of years of geological history. We were specifically tasked with collecting samples for laboratory analysis and documenting the stratigraphic sequence of the cliff face. Dr. Hendricks had chosen the Skull Cliff location because it offered an excellent cross-section of Paleozoic limestone formations that are not easily accessible at other Grand Canyon sites. The cliff face displays clear boundaries between different geological periods, with fossil evidence embedded in the rock layers that tell the story of ancient marine environments. Our assignment required us to identify and document at least 12 distinct sedimentary layers, collect samples from each layer, and analyze the mineral composition using portable field equipment. We arrived at the base camp area on a Thursday morning in mid-December. when the desert air was cold enough to require heavy jackets but clear enough to provide excellent visibility for our work. Dr. Hendricks established strict safety protocols for our cliff face examination, including buddy system requirements, time limits for individual exploration, and mandatory check-ins every 2 hours. She emphasized repeatedly that graduate research was not worth risking life or limb, and that any samples we could not safely collect would have to be left for future expeditions with more specialized equipment. The limestone cliff face at Skull Cliff rises nearly 400 feet from the canyon floor, with natural ledges and fractures that make it possible to examine different geological layers without technical climbing equipment. The rock is predominantly white and gray limestone with distinctive red and orange mineral staining from iron oxide deposits. What makes this location particularly valuable for geological study is the exceptional preservation of fossil specimens and the clear delineation between different sedimentary periods that occurred when this region was covered by ancient seas. My specific assignment focused on the middle section of the cliff face, approximately 150 feet above the canyon floor, where Permian limestone formations transition into Triassic sandstone layers. This boundary represents one of the most significant geological transitions in Grand Canyon stratigraphy, marking the end of the Paleozoic era and the beginning of the Mesozoic era. I was responsible for documenting this transition zone and collecting samples that would allow us to analyze the environmental conditions during this crucial period in Earth's history. On the second day of our fieldwork, while examining the Permian limestone layer at approximately noon when the lighting conditions were optimal, I noticed something unusual embedded in the rock face that did not match any of the typical marine fossils we expected to find in this formation. The object appeared to be bone fragments, but they were much larger than any known marine organism from the Permian period, and showed characteristics that seemed inconsistent with the geological age of the surrounding rock. The bone fragments were partially exposed in a natural crack in the limestone, appearing to be the remains of some type of vertebrate organism. But according to our geological knowledge, terrestrial vertebrates of the size indicated by these bone fragments should not exist in Permian marine limestone formations. The bones were too large to belong to fish or marine reptiles from that period, and they showed structural characteristics that suggested an adaptation to terrestrial rather than aquatic environments. I called over my field partner, Jessica Martinez, who was working on adjacent sections of the cliff face. Jessica has extensive experience with paleontological specimens from her undergraduate work at the Museum of Natural History, and I wanted her professional opinion before documenting what appeared to be an anomalous discovery. When she examined the bone fragments through our field magnifying equipment, her reaction was immediate concern rather than excitement about a potential significant find. The bone fragments appeared to be humanoid in structure, but scaled to a size that would indicate an individual of extraordinary height and bone density. The femur fragment that was most clearly visible suggested a being that would have stood at least 9 or 10 feet tall when alive, with bone thickness that exceeded normal human proportions by a significant margin. More disturbing was the apparent age of the bones, which seemed to be contemporaneous with the limestone formation rather than a later intrusion into older rock. Jessica and I spent the remainder of that afternoon carefully photographing and documenting the bone fragments without attempting to extract them from the limestone matrix. Our field protocols required that any unusual discoveries be reported to Dr. Hendricks before any collection or removal attempts were made. We used our GPS equipment to record the exact coordinates of the find, and took detailed photographs from multiple angles with measurement scales to document the size and position of the visible bone fragments. When we reported our discovery to Dr. Hendricks that evening during our group debriefing session, her reaction was unexpectedly negative. Instead of the scientific excitement we anticipated, she became visibly uncomfortable and insisted that we had misidentified marine reptile fossils or perhaps encountered bones from a much more recent intrusion into the older limestone. She refused to examine our photographs in detail and ordered us to focus our remaining fieldwork on other sections of the cliff face. But Jessica and I could not simply dismiss what we had documented. The bone fragments were clearly visible and photographically documented, and our geological training allowed us to distinguish between different types of fossilized remains. These were definitely not marine reptile fossils, and they showed no evidence of being recent intrusions into older rock formations. The bones appeared to be genuinely ancient and genuinely anomalous for their geological context. The following morning, Jessica and I returned to the location of our discovery before the official start of our scheduled fieldwork. We wanted to conduct more detailed examination and potentially collect small samples that would allow for laboratory analysis without compromising the overall specimen. Our plan was to gather enough evidence to support our initial observations and present a compelling case to Dr. Hendricks for official documentation of the find. When we reached the location where we had found the bone fragments the previous day, we discovered that the natural crack in the limestone had been significantly enlarged, apparently by recent fracturing or weathering. More bone fragments were now visible, including what appeared to be portions of a skull that showed both human and non-human characteristics. The cranial capacity suggested intelligence comparable to modern humans, but the overall bone structure was unlike any known hominin species from the fossil record. As we documented these newly exposed specimens, we began to notice other anomalous features in the surrounding limestone. There were carved markings or symbols embedded in the rock face near the bone fragments, appearing to be deliberate engravings rather than natural geological features. The symbols were geometric in nature and showed evidence of being created with tools, but they were clearly ancient and integrated into the limestone formation rather than being recent additions to the rock surface. The most disturbing discovery came when we used our portable ground-penetrating radar equipment to examine the cliff face behind the visible bone fragments. The radar signatures indicated a much larger skeletal structure extending deep into the limestone, suggesting that what we could see was only a small portion of a complete specimen. The radar data showed bone structures continuing for several meters into the rock face, indicating a discovery of potentially enormous scientific significance. But as we continued our unauthorized examination, we began to experience equipment malfunctions that we could not explain through normal technical problems. Our digital cameras began producing images with strange distortions and color anomalies that occurred only when photographing the bone fragments and surrounding symbols. Our GPS unit started giving inconsistent coordinate readings, and our portable radio communications with the base camp became filled with static and interference. More concerning were the physical sensations we began experiencing during our extended exposure to the discovery site. Both Jessica and I reported feeling disoriented and nauseous after spending more than an hour in close proximity to the bone fragments. We experienced difficulty concentrating and found ourselves making basic errors in our documentation procedures that we would never normally make during fieldwork. There was also a persistent sense of being observed or watched, even though we were alone on the cliff face. When we finally returned to base camp and reported our expanded findings to Dr. Hendricks, her reaction was swift and decisive. She immediately ordered the termination of all fieldwork at the Skull Cliff site and began preparations for immediate departure. She confiscated all of our photographic equipment and documentation materials, claiming that they were needed for official review by the university administration. She also made us sign non-disclosure agreements regarding any unusual discoveries made during the field trip. The official explanation provided to the other students was that safety concerns and weather predictions necessitated an early end to the field trip. Dr. Hendricks announced that our remaining assignments would be completed using geological samples from other locations and that the Skull Cliff site would not be used for future fieldwork due to unstable rock conditions and access difficulties. She emphasized that any student discussion of unauthorized discoveries or speculation about unusual findings would result in academic discipline and potential removal from the graduate program. During our return journey to the university, Jessica and I had an opportunity to discuss our experience privately. We both agreed that our discoveries at Skull Cliff represented something far more significant than normal paleontological specimens, and that Dr. Hendricks' reaction suggested she was aware of similar findings or had been specifically instructed to prevent students from making such discoveries. The non-disclosure agreements and confiscation of our documentation materials indicated institutional knowledge of phenomena that were being actively suppressed. Over the following weeks, Jessica and I attempted to research similar discoveries at other Grand Canyon geological sites, but we found that access to relevant scientific literature was restricted, and that several research papers we attempted to locate had been removed from university databases. Our attempts to contact other geology students who had previously studied at Skull Cliff were unsuccessful, and we learned that the site had been used for student fieldwork only intermittently over the past decade. 3 months after our field trip, Jessica received notification that her graduate fellowship had been terminated due to budget constraints, and she was forced to leave the university program. I received a similar notification 2 weeks later, effectively ending both of our academic careers in geological sciences. Dr. Hendricks avoided all contact with us after our return from Skull Cliff, and our requests for meetings or explanations were referred to university administration officials who claimed no knowledge of our concerns. I have since changed my academic focus to engineering and have not returned to geological fieldwork. Jessica moved to another state and now works in environmental consulting. We maintain occasional contact, but neither of us has attempted to publicize or pursue our discoveries at Skull Cliff. The non-disclosure agreements we signed carry significant legal penalties, and we have no desire to face institutional retaliation or professional consequences for discussing our experience. But I know what we found embedded in that limestone cliff face, and I know that it challenges fundamental assumptions about the geological and archaeological record of the Grand Canyon region. The bone fragments we documented belong to beings that should not have existed during the Permian period according to conventional scientific understanding, and the symbols carved into the rock face suggested technological capabilities that predate known human civilization by millions of years. There are discoveries waiting beneath the surface of our planet that would revolutionize our understanding of history and evolution, but there are also institutional forces committed to ensuring that such discoveries remain buried. The limestone cliffs of the Grand Canyon contain evidence of ancient civilizations and unknown species that existed long before conventional science believed such things were possible. And I suspect that our discovery at Skull Cliff was not unique or unprecedented. The bone fragments are still there, embedded in the limestone cliff face, waiting for the next group of students or researchers who venture into areas they are not supposed to explore. But I doubt that future discoveries will be treated any differently than ours were, and I suspect that the truth about what lies beneath the surface of Skull Cliff will continue to be suppressed by those who have the authority to control access to such information. After 23 years as a Grand Canyon park ranger, I thought I had seen every type of emergency call possible until I got the radio transmission from Skull Cliff sector on November 15th. My name is Linda Mae Patterson, and I have worked for the National Park Service since I graduated from Northern Arizona University with a degree in environmental science. During my career, I have responded to everything from routine medical emergencies to search and rescue operations for missing hikers. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened that cold Tuesday morning when the call came through about the missing research team. The transmission came from Ranger Station 7, which monitors the remote southeastern sections of the park, including the Skull Cliff area. The voice on the radio belonged to Tommy Rodriguez, a newer ranger who had been stationed there for only 6 months. His voice was shaking when he reported that a geological research team from Arizona State University had failed to check in at their scheduled time, and their emergency beacon had been activated but was transmitting from a location that should not have been accessible to anyone on foot. I was the senior ranger on duty that morning, so the responsibility for coordinating the response fell to me. The missing team consisted of 3 graduate students and their faculty advisor, Dr. Margaret Chen, who were conducting a week-long study of mineral deposits in the Skull Cliff limestone formations. They had proper permits for the research area and were experienced in desert survival and technical climbing. Their last confirmed contact had been at 8 o'clock the previous evening when they radioed in their location and confirmed that all team members were present and accounted for. The emergency beacon signal was coming from approximately 2 miles deeper into the canyon than their reported position, in an area that our topographical maps showed as impassable vertical cliff face. There were no established trails or climbing routes that would have allowed the team to reach the beacon's coordinates, and the terrain was considered too dangerous for recreational access. The signal was strong and consistent, indicating that the beacon was functioning properly and had not been damaged or compromised. I assembled a search and rescue team consisting of 4 experienced rangers and 2 volunteer climbers who had extensive knowledge of the Skull Cliff area. We loaded our vehicles with technical rescue equipment, medical supplies, and enough food and water for an extended operation. The drive to the remote access point took nearly 2 hours over rough terrain, and we began our approach to the beacon coordinates on foot at approximately noon. The hike to the general area took another 3 hours because we had to navigate around several sections of unstable rock and loose scree. As we got closer to the beacon signal, the terrain became increasingly difficult and dangerous. The limestone cliffs rose nearly vertical on all sides, and the only way forward was through a narrow canyon that seemed to dead end against the main cliff face. Our GPS units confirmed that we were approaching the beacon coordinates, but visually we could see no way for anyone to have reached this location. When we finally located the source of the emergency signal, we found the beacon device sitting on a narrow ledge approximately 100 feet up the main cliff face. There was no climbing equipment visible, no ropes or anchors that would have enabled someone to reach that ledge, and no obvious route up or down from the position. The beacon was simply sitting there alone, transmitting its distress signal into the empty desert air. More disturbing was the fact that the ledge appeared to be completely inaccessible from any direction we could determine. We used binoculars and telephoto camera lenses to examine the ledge and surrounding area in detail. The beacon was definitely the one assigned to Dr. Chen's research team, but there were no other signs of human presence on the ledge or anywhere in the immediate vicinity. No backpacks, no climbing gear, no personal belongings that would indicate the team had been in that location. The beacon appeared to have been placed deliberately in a position where it would be visible but not retrievable without specialized high-angle rescue equipment. One of our volunteer climbers, Sarah Mitchell, who had been climbing in the Grand Canyon region for over 15 years, examined the cliff face with professional climbing equipment and determined that reaching the ledge would require technical gear and skills that exceeded what a geological research team would normally carry. The rock face offered no natural handholds or footholds, and the limestone was too soft and fractured to support traditional climbing anchors. Even with proper equipment, the ascent would be extremely dangerous and would require multiple experienced climbers working together. We spent the remainder of that day searching the canyon floor and surrounding areas for any signs of the missing team. We found their base camp exactly where their permits indicated it should be, with all equipment still in place and no signs of disturbance or hasty departure. Their research notes were neatly organized, their food supplies were untouched, and their sleeping bags appeared to have been slept in the previous night. Everything suggested that they had simply vanished sometime between their evening radio check and the following morning when they failed to report in. The search continued for 6 more days with additional resources brought in from other Park Service units and local law enforcement agencies. We expanded the search radius to include areas that would have required the team to travel much farther than their research objectives would have necessitated. Helicopters conducted aerial surveys of the entire region, and ground teams covered every accessible square mile within reasonable walking distance of their base camp. We found no traces of the missing researchers anywhere in the expanded search area. On the 4th day of the search, we finally retrieved the emergency beacon from the cliff ledge using helicopter and technical rope rescue specialists. The device was examined by our communications technician and found to be functioning normally with no signs of damage or tampering. The activation log showed that the beacon had been turned on manually at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, several hours after the team's last radio contact. The manual activation meant that someone had deliberately triggered the emergency signal rather than it being activated automatically by impact or water damage. What disturbed me most about the beacon retrieval was something that our helicopter pilot mentioned during the debriefing. He reported that while hovering near the cliff face, his aircraft had experienced unusual electromagnetic interference that affected both his navigation equipment and radio communications. The interference was localized to the immediate area around the ledge where the beacon was found, and it cleared up completely once he moved the helicopter away from that specific location. He had never experienced similar interference during thousands of hours of flying in the Grand Canyon region. The official investigation concluded that the research team had somehow become disoriented and wandered away from their base camp, possibly during the night hours when visibility would have been limited. The theory suggested that they had fallen victim to exposure or accident in a remote area that had not yet been searched, and that the emergency beacon had been activated and thrown or carried to the cliff ledge by unknown means, possibly wind or wildlife. The case was classified as a missing persons investigation with no evidence of foul play, but there were aspects of the case that the official report did not adequately address. The team consisted of experienced researchers who were familiar with desert survival and navigation techniques. They carried GPS devices, emergency whistles, and other safety equipment that should have prevented them from becoming lost in familiar terrain. The condition of their base camp suggested a planned and organized departure rather than a panicked flight or emergency evacuation. Most significantly, the placement of the emergency beacon in an inaccessible location suggested deliberate human action rather than accidental loss or natural forces. Someone had to have placed that device on the cliff ledge, but our investigation found no evidence that anyone with the necessary climbing skills had been in the area during the relevant time period. The electromagnetic interference reported by our helicopter pilot also suggested unusual environmental factors that we could not explain through normal geological or atmospheric phenomena. 6 months after the disappearance, I received an unofficial report from a colleague at Ranger Station 7 that Tommy Rodriguez had requested a transfer to a different park assignment. When I contacted Tommy directly, he told me that he had been experiencing recurring nightmares about voices calling for help from the Skull Cliff area, particularly during the overnight shifts when he was alone at the remote station. He said that the voices seemed to come from the direction of the cliff face where we had found the emergency beacon, and that they occurred most frequently around 3 o'clock in the morning, which was the same time the beacon activation had been logged. I have never filed an official report about Tommy's experiences because they fall outside the scope of normal Park Service documentation. But his account troubled me enough that I began conducting my own unofficial monitoring of the Skull Cliff area during overnight patrols. Over the following months, I made several solo visits to the location where we had found the research team's base camp, usually during the early morning hours when the desert is at its quietest. On 3 separate occasions, I heard sounds that seemed to originate from the cliff face area where the emergency beacon had been recovered. The sounds were difficult to describe precisely, but they resembled human voices calling for help or assistance. The voices were too distant and distorted to make out specific words, but the tone and rhythm suggested people in distress trying to communicate across a great distance. Each time I investigated these sounds with flashlights and binoculars, I found no visual evidence of human presence in the area. The case of Dr. Chen's research team remains officially unsolved, and no trace of the 4 missing researchers has ever been found despite extensive searches and ongoing investigations. The Skull Cliff area has been temporarily restricted to scientific research requiring special permits, and routine patrol coverage of that sector has been reduced due to budget constraints and personnel reassignments. The official explanation for these administrative changes relates to budget priorities and resource allocation, but I suspect that other factors may have influenced the decision to limit Park Service presence in that particular area. I am scheduled to retire from the National Park Service next year after completing my 24th year of service. The missing research team case will probably remain open indefinitely, joining the dozens of other unsolved disappearances that occur in national parks across the country each year. But I know that something happened to those 4 people in the Skull Cliff area that cannot be explained by the standard theories about getting lost or falling victim to natural hazards. The emergency beacon placement, the electromagnetic interference, and the ongoing reports of voices in the night all point to phenomena that fall outside our normal understanding of missing persons cases in wilderness areas. There are places in the Grand Canyon where the combination of geological history, isolation, and unknown environmental factors creates conditions that we do not fully comprehend. And I believe that Skull Cliff is one of those places where our conventional explanations prove inadequate. We came to film a documentary about Grand Canyon legends, but our camera operator started recording things that were not there during our last shoot at Skull Cliff. My name is Jasmine Washington, and I work as a producer for independent documentary films based out of Las Vegas. Our production company specializes in paranormal and unexplained phenomena content for streaming platforms and cable television networks. The project that brought us to Skull Cliff was supposed to be a straightforward exploration of Native American legends and geological mysteries. But it became something far more disturbing than any of us were prepared to handle. The documentary concept originated from research conducted by our director Marcus Chen, who had been studying reports of unusual phenomena in remote areas of the Grand Canyon for over 2 years. Our initial proposal focused on indigenous folklore about spiritual boundaries and sacred sites that should not be disturbed by modern visitors. The network executives were interested in the project because it combined historical research with contemporary mystery elements, and they approved funding for a 5-day shoot at various locations throughout the canyon region. Our crew consisted of 6 people, including myself as producer, Marcus as director, Sarah Mitchell as our primary camera operator, Robert Kim as sound engineer, Jennifer Adams as research coordinator, and Michael Torres as our local guide and safety coordinator. We had extensive experience filming in remote wilderness locations, and we carried professional-grade equipment including multiple cameras, sound recording systems, drone technology for aerial shots, and satellite communication devices for emergency situations. The first 3 days of filming went according to our planned schedule. We documented several well-known legend sites and conducted interviews with tribal elders and Park Service personnel who were willing to discuss the folklore and historical accounts associated with different areas of the Grand Canyon. Our footage was excellent quality, and we were capturing exactly the type of content that our network contacts had requested for the documentary series. Skull Cliff was scheduled as our final location because Marcus wanted to end the documentary with the most visually dramatic and mysterious site we could access within our budget and time constraints. The limestone cliff formations provided an excellent backdrop for our concluding segment about the boundaries between scientific explanation and unexplained phenomena. We planned to spend our final day filming establishing shots, conducting our last interviews, and capturing sunset footage that would serve as the closing sequence for the documentary. We arrived at Skull Cliff early on Thursday morning and began setting up our equipment for a full day of filming. Sarah positioned her primary camera system on a stable tripod to capture wide shots of the cliff face, while Robert established his sound recording equipment to document both our narration and the natural acoustics of the canyon environment. The weather conditions were perfect for filming, with clear skies and excellent visibility that would allow us to capture the limestone formations in optimal lighting. The first unusual incident occurred around 10 o'clock in the morning when Sarah was filming establishing shots of the cliff face through her telephoto lens. She reported seeing movement on the cliff face that appeared to be people climbing on areas that should have been inaccessible to human passage. When we examined the cliff face directly with binoculars, we could see no signs of climbers or any equipment that would enable such an ascent. But Sarah insisted that her camera was recording human figures moving across the limestone walls. We reviewed the footage immediately using Sarah's camera display screen, and we could clearly see dark shapes moving along the cliff face in patterns that suggested deliberate climbing rather than shadows or optical illusions. The shapes appeared to be human in form, but scaled to a size that would indicate individuals of extraordinary height and apparent ability to cling to vertical rock surfaces. The footage was technically perfect, with no signs of camera malfunction or recording errors. Robert began experiencing audio recording problems around the same time that Sarah was documenting the visual anomalies. His professional sound equipment was picking up voices and conversations that none of us could hear directly. The recorded voices seemed to be speaking in multiple languages, including what sounded like indigenous dialects, but also languages that Robert could not identify despite his extensive experience with international documentary projects. The voices appeared to be having conversations about our presence and our filming activities. Marcus made the decision to continue filming while documenting these unusual phenomena as part of our documentary content. We had been hired to investigate unexplained occurrences at Grand Canyon locations, and we were clearly encountering exactly the type of material that would make our documentary compelling and authentic. We began treating the anomalous footage and audio recordings as legitimate documentation of paranormal activity rather than technical problems with our equipment. But as the day progressed, the phenomena became increasingly intense and difficult to explain through equipment malfunctions or environmental factors. Sarah's camera began recording multiple exposure effects that showed the same locations at what appeared to be different time periods simultaneously. The cliff face would appear in her footage, showing both its current state and what looked like the same location during different historical periods, with evidence of human activity spanning what appeared to be decades or centuries. The most disturbing development came when Sarah's camera began recording people and activities that were clearly not present at our filming location. The footage showed individuals in period clothing from different historical eras, including what appeared to be Native American ceremonies, early European explorers, and groups of people in clothing from various decades of the 20th century. All of these people appeared to be occupying the same physical space as our contemporary filming location, but existing in what seemed to be different time periods. Robert's audio equipment was simultaneously recording conversations and activities that corresponded to the visual anomalies that Sarah was documenting. We could hear voices discussing events and referencing technologies from different historical periods, including conversations that seemed to be occurring in the present day but involving people who were not physically present at our location. The audio quality was excellent and showed no signs of interference or external radio transmissions. By afternoon, our entire crew was experiencing disorientation and difficulty maintaining focus on our planned filming schedule. The combination of visual and audio phenomena was creating a psychological impact that made it difficult to distinguish between what was actually happening at our location and what was being recorded by our equipment. We began to question whether our cameras and recording devices were documenting real events or somehow creating the very phenomena they appeared to be capturing. Marcus attempted to maintain professional filming procedures, but it became increasingly clear that our equipment was recording far more than we had intended to document. The footage showed not only the historical figures and activities I described, but also contemporary people who appeared to be filming crews like ourselves from different time periods. We could see other documentary teams, photographers, and researchers working at the same Skull Cliff location during what appeared to be different decades. The final incident occurred late in the afternoon when Sarah's camera began recording our own crew from what appeared to be different perspectives and time periods. We could see ourselves in the footage, but also versions of ourselves that appeared to be older or younger, wearing different clothing and using different equipment. The recorded versions of ourselves seemed to be aware of being filmed and were looking directly into Sarah's camera despite the fact that we were not posing for those shots. Robert's audio equipment recorded conversations between these different versions of ourselves discussing filming projects and documentary content that we had never worked on. The voices were definitely ours, but the conversations referenced experiences and locations that we had no memory of visiting. The audio suggested that we had been filming at Skull Cliff multiple times over a period of many years, though this was actually our first visit to the location. We made the decision to end filming immediately and pack our equipment for departure. The psychological impact of the recorded phenomena was affecting our ability to think clearly and make rational decisions about our safety and the completion of our project. Marcus was concerned that continued exposure to whatever was causing these recording anomalies might have lasting effects on our mental health and professional capabilities. But when we attempted to leave Skull Cliff, we discovered that our vehicles would not start despite the fact that they had been functioning normally when we arrived. Our satellite communication devices were not receiving signals, and our GPS navigation systems were providing inconsistent location readings. We appeared to be stranded at the filming location with no ability to call for assistance or navigate back to established roads. We spent the night at Skull Cliff using our emergency camping equipment, but none of us were able to sleep due to ongoing audio and visual phenomena that continued even after our cameras and recording equipment had been turned off. We could hear conversations and activities around our campsite that suggested the presence of other people, but visual inspection revealed that we were alone at the location. The sounds continued throughout the night and seemed to be coming from different time periods simultaneously. The next morning, our vehicles started normally and our communication and navigation equipment resumed normal function. We were able to leave Skull Cliff without further difficulty and return to Las Vegas to begin reviewing our footage and planning the editing process for our documentary. But when we attempted to access the recorded material from our final day of filming, we discovered that all of our equipment had experienced complete data corruption. The footage and audio recordings from Skull Cliff were completely unusable due to file corruption that affected every storage device and backup system we had used. Our professional equipment had never experienced such comprehensive data loss, and technical analysis could not identify any cause for the corruption. We lost an entire day of filming and had no usable content from what should have been the most important location in our documentary project. We never completed the Grand Canyon Legends documentary because we could not explain the loss of our Skull Cliff footage to the network executives who had funded our project. The incident effectively ended our working relationship with that particular network, and several members of our crew left the documentary production industry shortly afterward. Marcus now works in commercial video production, and Sarah has moved to still photography rather than cinematography. I have never returned to Skull Cliff, and I now avoid documentary projects that involve investigations of unexplained phenomena or paranormal activity. Our equipment recorded things that should not have been possible, and I suspect that some locations are not meant to be documented by contemporary technology. There are places where the act of filming creates more questions than answers, and Skull Cliff appears to be one of those locations where the boundaries between past and present become dangerously unstable. My grandfather told me stories about Skull Cliff that I never believed until the day I had to guide tourists there and witnessed why our people avoid that cursed place. My name is Thomas Bigay, and I am a member of the Navajo Nation who works as a licensed wilderness guide for tourists visiting remote areas of the Grand Canyon. For 15 years, I have led hiking expeditions, photography tours, and cultural education trips throughout the canyon region, sharing the natural beauty and traditional knowledge of our ancestral lands with visitors from around the world. Growing up on the reservation, I heard many stories from my grandfather about places in the canyon that were dangerous or spiritually significant in ways that outsiders could not understand. He would tell me about locations where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world was thin, and where modern people could encounter things that were not meant for contemporary eyes. I always thought these were just traditional stories meant to teach respect for the land, but I never considered them to be literal warnings about specific dangers. Skull Cliff was one of the places my grandfather specifically warned me never to visit, especially not with groups of tourists who lacked proper spiritual preparation and protection. He told me that the limestone formations in that area contained the remains of ancient beings who had violated natural laws and been imprisoned in the rock as punishment for their crimes against the earth. According to his stories, these beings could influence the minds of people who spent too much time near their stone prison, causing them to see and hear things that would drive them to madness. But as a professional wilderness guide, I could not simply refuse clients who requested trips to specific locations based on traditional stories that I did not fully believe. When the Henderson family from Denver contacted me in March to arrange a 3-day guided tour that specifically included Skull Cliff, I accepted their booking despite my grandfather's warnings. They were experienced hikers who had done extensive research on Grand Canyon geology and were particularly interested in the limestone formations and fossil deposits that made Skull Cliff scientifically significant. The Henderson family consisted of Dr. Michael Henderson, a geology professor at the University of Colorado, his wife Jennifer, who worked as a museum curator, and their 2 teenage children, Sarah and Robert. They were knowledgeable about desert safety and wilderness survival, and they carried professional quality equipment for photography and specimen collection. They seemed like ideal clients who would appreciate both the natural beauty and the cultural significance of the areas we would be visiting. The first 2 days of our guided tour went exactly according to my planned itinerary. We visited several established viewpoints and geological sites where I could share both scientific information and traditional Navajo perspectives on the landscape and its history. The Henderson family was respectful and genuinely interested in learning about indigenous relationships with the land, and I felt comfortable sharing some of the cultural knowledge that my grandfather had taught me about reading the desert environment. On our final day, we hiked to Skull Cliff in the early morning hours when the lighting conditions would be optimal for photography, and when the desert temperatures would still be manageable for extended outdoor activity. I led the family to a safe viewing area approximately half a mile from the main cliff formations, where they could take photographs and conduct their geological observations without venturing into areas that I considered potentially dangerous based on my grandfather's warnings. But Dr. Henderson was not satisfied with observing the cliff formations from a distance. He wanted to collect mineral samples and examine the limestone layers up close, which would require hiking much closer to the base of the cliffs and potentially climbing to reach the most interesting geological features. He had permits for specimen collection and assured me that he had extensive experience with technical climbing in canyon environments. Against my better judgment and despite the persistent feeling that my grandfather's warnings should be taken seriously, I agreed to guide the family closer to the cliff face so that Dr. Henderson could conduct his geological research. We approached the limestone formations using established animal trails that provided relatively safe passage through the rocky terrain, and we reached the base of the cliffs without incident around midday when the sun was directly overhead. The first signs that something was wrong appeared when we were setting up our base camp at the bottom of the cliff. Sarah, the teenage daughter, began complaining of severe headaches and nausea that seemed to come and went without any obvious cause. She had been fine during our morning hike, but as soon as we established our position near the limestone cliffs, she became visibly ill and disoriented. Her mother attributed the symptoms to altitude and desert heat, but I recognized the signs that my grandfather had described as the beginning of spiritual interference. Dr. Henderson began his geological examination of the cliff face, using professional tools to collect samples from different limestone layers and documenting the mineral composition of the various rock formations. But as he worked, he started reporting discoveries that did not match any known geological features of the Skull Cliff area. He claimed to be finding fossil specimens that appeared to be human remains embedded in rock formations that predated human presence in North America by millions of years. More disturbing were the photographs that Jennifer was taking of her husband's geological work. When she reviewed the images on her digital camera, she discovered that the photographs showed additional people working alongside Dr. Henderson who had not been present when the pictures were taken. The photographs clearly showed her husband collecting samples, but they also showed other individuals wearing different clothing and using different tools, as if multiple groups of researchers from different time periods were occupying the same location simultaneously. Robert, the teenage son, began experiencing auditory hallucinations around the same time that his sister was dealing with her unexplained illness, and his mother was discovering the anomalous photographs. He reported hearing voices speaking in languages he could not understand, but the voices seemed to be providing him with detailed information about the geological history of the cliff area and the location of mineral deposits that his father had not yet discovered. I recognized these symptoms as exactly what my grandfather had warned me about, and I knew that we needed to leave Skull Cliff immediately before the spiritual interference became more intense or dangerous. But when I tried to convince the Henderson family that we should return to our established campsite, they were reluctant to abandon Dr. Henderson's research when he was making what appeared to be significant geological discoveries. The situation deteriorated rapidly during the afternoon hours when the sun began casting longer shadows across the cliff face. Sarah's illness became so severe that she was unable to walk without assistance, and she began speaking in what sounded like the same unknown languages that Robert was hearing in his auditory hallucinations. Jennifer's camera continued to record people and activities that were not present, and the photographs began showing the cliff area during what appeared to be different historical periods. Dr. Henderson became completely focused on his geological work to the exclusion of his family's obvious distress, collecting samples and making measurements with an intensity that seemed driven by something beyond normal scientific curiosity. He claimed that the limestone contained evidence of advanced civilizations that predated known human history, and he was convinced that his discoveries would revolutionize understanding of North American archaeology. But the most terrifying development came when I realized that I was also beginning to experience the same symptoms that were affecting the Henderson family. I started hearing voices in traditional Navajo dialect that seemed to be coming from within the cliff face itself. The voices were warning me about the danger we were in and instructing me to use traditional protection ceremonies that my grandfather had taught me but that I had never taken seriously until that moment. Following the guidance of the voices, I began performing a traditional cleansing ceremony using sacred tobacco and prayers that my grandfather had taught me for dealing with spiritual interference. I instructed the Henderson family to gather closely around me and to avoid looking directly at the cliff face while I completed the ceremony. The family was initially skeptical about participating in what they saw as superstitious rituals, but their obvious distress made them willing to try anything that might provide relief. The ceremony worked immediately and dramatically. Sarah's illness disappeared completely, Robert's auditory hallucinations stopped, and Jennifer's camera began functioning normally without recording anomalous images. Dr. Henderson seemed to wake up from his obsessive focus on the geological research and expressed concern about his family's welfare for the first time since we had arrived at the cliff site. We packed our equipment quickly and left Skull Cliff that afternoon, returning to established campgrounds where we spent our final night before returning to civilization. The Henderson family did not discuss their experiences at Skull Cliff during our remaining time together, and they seemed eager to forget what had happened during their geological research expedition. When Dr. Henderson later attempted to analyze the mineral samples he had collected from the limestone cliff, he found that they were completely ordinary limestone with no unusual properties or embedded fossils. The photographs that had shown multiple groups of researchers working at the same location showed only the Henderson family when reviewed in normal lighting conditions. All evidence of their anomalous experiences had disappeared once they were away from the direct influence of the cliff site. I never guided another tour group to Skull Cliff, and I now refuse requests from clients who specifically want to visit that location. My grandfather's warnings about places where the spirit world intersects with the physical world were not traditional stories or metaphorical teachings about respecting nature. They were literal warnings about specific locations where ancient spiritual forces remain active and can influence the minds and perceptions of people who lack proper preparation and protection. The limestone cliffs contain something more than geological formations and mineral deposits. There are places in the Grand Canyon where traditional knowledge and modern science intersect in ways that most people are not prepared to understand. And Skull Cliff is one of those places where our ancestors left warnings that should be heeded by anyone who values their mental and spiritual health. I have free climbed some of the most dangerous cliffs in North America, but nothing prepared me for what I found in the hidden cave system behind Skull Cliff's rock face. My name is Samantha Mitchell, and I have been a professional rock climber for 12 years, specializing in technical ascents of limestone formations throughout the southwestern United States. I have conquered vertical walls in Yosemite, completed first ascents in Utah's Red Rock Country, and guided climbing expeditions in remote wilderness areas where few people have ever set foot. The Skull Cliff ascent was not originally planned as part of any official climbing expedition. I was in the Grand Canyon area conducting reconnaissance for a climbing magazine article about undocumented limestone routes when I discovered the cliff formation during a solo hiking trip in February. The limestone walls presented technical challenges that immediately caught my attention, with vertical sections that would require advanced climbing techniques and equipment that most recreational climbers would never attempt. What made Skull Cliff particularly appealing from a climbing perspective was the apparent absence of any established routes or previous climbing attempts. The cliff face showed no signs of anchor points, rappel stations, or the chalk marks that typically indicate where other climbers have attempted ascents. This suggested that I would be making a first ascent of a significant limestone formation, which represents the kind of achievement that serious climbers spend years searching for in increasingly crowded climbing areas. I returned to Skull Cliff 3 weeks later with a complete rack of climbing gear, including ropes, hardware, safety equipment, and enough supplies for a multi-day climbing expedition. My plan was to establish several different routes up the cliff face, document the climbs with photography, and potentially publish the first guidebook coverage of what appeared to be a virgin climbing area within reasonable access of major population centers. The limestone rock quality at Skull Cliff was exceptional, offering solid handholds and reliable protection placements that made the technical climbing both challenging and safe. I completed 2 successful routes up different sections of the cliff face during my first day, reaching heights of approximately 200 feet above the canyon floor and establishing anchor systems that would allow for clean rappel descents back to the base. But during my third route attempt on the main cliff face, I discovered something that was not visible from ground level or from the lower sections of the cliff. At approximately 150 feet above the canyon floor, the limestone formation contained a horizontal opening that appeared to be the entrance to a natural cave system extending deep into the cliff structure. The opening was large enough for human passage, but was positioned in a location that would be impossible to reach without advanced climbing skills. The cave entrance was not marked on any topographical maps of the area, and it showed no signs of previous human visitation despite being located in a region where Native American peoples had lived for thousands of years. The lack of any historical or archaeological documentation of the cave system suggested that it had remained hidden and inaccessible throughout recorded history, making it a potentially significant discovery from both geological and anthropological perspectives. I decided to explore the cave system as part of my climbing expedition, using my technical gear to establish a secure anchor point at the cave entrance that would allow for safe exploration and retreat if necessary. I carried extra headlamps, rope, and emergency supplies into the cave passages, following standard spelunking safety protocols despite my lack of extensive cave exploration experience. The cave passages extended much deeper into the cliff than I had anticipated based on the external appearance of the limestone formation. After crawling and climbing through narrow tunnels for approximately 200 yards, I emerged into a large underground chamber that appeared to be a natural cavern with dimensions comparable to a cathedral interior. My headlamp illuminated smooth limestone walls that rose beyond the reach of my light beam into what appeared to be a domed ceiling. But the most remarkable discovery in the underground chamber was evidence of extensive human modification and habitation that appeared to date back centuries or possibly millennia. The cave walls contained carved symbols and pictographs that resembled Native American petroglyphs, but included geometric patterns and symbolic representations that I had never seen in any archaeological documentation of southwestern indigenous art. More significantly, the chamber contained constructed stone platforms, water collection systems, and storage areas that indicated sophisticated engineering and long-term habitation by people who possessed advanced knowledge of underground construction techniques. The stonework was expertly fitted without mortar, using techniques that matched the precision of ancient Puebloan architecture, but on a scale that exceeded anything I had encountered in documented archaeological sites. The cave system extended beyond the main chamber through additional passages that led deeper into the cliff structure. Using my climbing gear to navigate vertical sections within the cave, I discovered multiple levels of chambers and tunnels that formed a complex underground network. Each level contained evidence of human habitation, including sleeping areas, food storage, tool caches, and elaborate stone carvings that suggested a sophisticated and long-established community. But despite the clear evidence of extensive human occupation, the cave system was completely empty of any contemporary inhabitants. The sleeping areas appeared recently used. Food, storage areas contained preserved supplies, and tool caches included both ancient implements and surprisingly modern equipment. It was as if an entire underground community had simply vanished, leaving behind their entire material culture and infrastructure. The most disturbing discovery came when I reached the deepest accessible level of the cave system, approximately 400 feet into the cliff structure and 100 feet below the original cave entrance. In the deepest chamber, I found evidence of recent climbing equipment, including ropes, anchors, and personal gear that clearly belonged to other climbers who had discovered and explored the cave system before my arrival. Among the abandoned climbing gear, I found personal identification and equipment tags that belonged to climbers I recognized from the professional climbing community. Michael Chen, Jennifer Adams, and Robert Torres were all accomplished climbers who had disappeared during solo climbing expeditions in Arizona over the past 2 years. Their disappearances had been attributed to climbing accidents in remote areas where rescue operations were unable to locate their bodies. But the climbing equipment in the deepest cave chamber was carefully organized and stored rather than scattered, as would be expected from climbing accidents or emergency situations. The gear appeared to have been deliberately cached by climbers who intended to return for it at a later time. Personal belongings, including journals, cameras, and survival supplies, suggested that these climbers had been using the cave system as a base camp for extended periods. The climbing journals contained detailed documentation of routes and exploration within the cave system, describing passages and chambers that extended much deeper than I had explored. The journal entries indicated that the missing climbers had discovered additional levels of the underground complex that contained increasingly elaborate stone construction and carved artwork, representing what they described as an ancient civilization of remarkable sophistication. But the final journal entries from each of the missing climbers described experiences that suggested psychological effects from extended time in the cave system. They reported hearing voices calling from deeper passages, seeing lights and movement in areas where no other people were present, and feeling compelled to explore increasingly dangerous sections of the underground complex despite their concerns about their safety and their ability to find their way back to the surface. The last entry in Michael Chen's journal, dated approximately 6 months before my discovery of the equipment cache, described his decision to attempt a descent into what he called the deepest chamber of the cave system, following voices that seemed to be calling for help from far below his position. His final written words expressed both excitement about making a significant discovery and concern that he might not be able to return to share his findings with the outside world. At that point, I made the immediate decision to retreat from the cave system and return to the surface as quickly as possible. The evidence suggested that other climbers had become lost or trapped in the deeper passages, and I had no desire to add my name to the list of missing persons associated with the Skull Cliff cave system. I left the cached equipment undisturbed and followed my established route back toward the cave entrance. But during my retreat through the cave passages, I began to experience the same phenomena that the missing climbers had described in their journals. I heard voices calling from deeper within the cave system, speaking in languages I could not identify but conveying an unmistakable sense of urgency and appeal for assistance. The voices seemed to know my name and were specifically calling for me to return to the deeper chambers. I also began experiencing equipment malfunctions that had not occurred during my initial exploration of the cave system. My primary headlamp began flickering and producing inconsistent illumination. My backup lights were draining their batteries at an abnormal rate, and my climbing rope was developing frays and weak points that had not been present when I entered the caves. Most disturbing was the growing sense that I was not alone in the cave passages despite having seen no evidence of other people during my exploration. I heard footsteps and movement behind me as I climbed toward the surface, and I frequently felt the sensation of someone pulling on my climbing rope in ways that seemed intentional rather than accidental contact with rock surfaces. I successfully exited the cave system and completed my rappel descent to the canyon floor, but the psychological effects of my underground experience continued for several weeks after I returned to civilization. I experienced recurring dreams about the missing climbers calling for rescue from the deepest chambers of the cave system, and I felt persistent guilt about leaving their equipment behind rather than attempting to continue their exploration. I never published my planned climbing article about Skull Cliff, and I have not returned to the area since my cave discovery. The climbing routes I established on the cliff face represent excellent technical challenges that would appeal to advanced climbers, but I cannot recommend the area knowing what lies hidden behind the limestone walls. There are discoveries waiting in those underground chambers that exceed the scope of recreational climbing activities, and I suspect that the missing climbers found something in the deepest passages that prevented them from returning to share their knowledge with the outside world. I took the overnight security job at the Skull Cliff Research Station because the pay was good and I needed the quiet. But some nights the silence is filled with sounds that should not exist. My name is Raymond Torres, and I have worked as a private security guard for 15 years. Mostly at construction sites, office buildings, and industrial facilities throughout New Mexico and Arizona. The assignment at Skull Cliff was different from my usual contracts because it involved protecting a remote scientific research facility, rather than preventing theft or vandalism at commercial properties. The research station was established by a consortium of universities and government agencies to study the geological and archaeological significance of the Skull Cliff area. The facility consisted of 3 modular buildings housing laboratory equipment, data storage systems, communication gear, and temporary living quarters for researchers who needed to stay on site during extended fieldwork periods. My job was to provide overnight security coverage from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning, 7 days a week, with 1 weekend off per month. The position was advertised as an ideal assignment for security guards who preferred working alone and could handle the isolation of a remote desert location. The pay was significantly higher than typical security work because of the location and the specialized nature of the research being conducted. The contract included housing in a comfortable trailer on the facility grounds, all utilities paid, and access to satellite internet and television for entertainment during the quiet overnight hours. During my initial orientation, the facility manager, Dr. Patricia Hendricks, explained that the research station operated with minimal staffing and that researchers were typically present only during daytime hours. My primary responsibilities were to monitor the perimeter security systems, conduct hourly facility inspections, maintain communication logs, and respond to any equipment alarms or unauthorized intrusions. She emphasized that the scientific equipment was extremely valuable and that maintaining security was essential for the ongoing research projects. The first few weeks of overnight shifts passed without incident. The desert location was indeed very quiet, with only occasional wildlife sounds and the normal settling noises from the modular buildings. I established a routine of hourly perimeter walks, equipment checks, and radio communications with the central monitoring station in Phoenix. The isolation was actually peaceful after years of dealing with urban security problems, and I found the work less stressful than my previous assignments. But as I became more familiar with the facility and the surrounding area, I began to notice unusual characteristics about the research station that had not been mentioned during my orientation. The security cameras were positioned not only to monitor approaches, to the buildings, but also to observe specific areas of the cliff face that seemed to have no relevance to protecting the facility. The motion sensors and alarm systems were calibrated to detect activity in areas that were far beyond the normal perimeter of the research station. More puzzling was the discovery that some of the scientific equipment in the laboratory buildings was designed for monitoring and recording rather than analysis or research. There were sensitive audio recording systems with directional microphones aimed at the cliff face, seismic monitoring equipment that seemed designed to detect underground activity, and electromagnetic field detectors that operated continuously throughout the night. This equipment suggested that the researchers were studying active phenomena rather than static geological formations. The first unusual incident occurred during my third week on the job at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday night. While conducting my regular perimeter inspection, I heard what sounded like voices calling from the direction of Skull Cliff, about a quarter-mile from the research station. The voices were too distant to make out specific words, but they seemed to be human rather than animal sounds, and they appeared to be trying to communicate or call for attention. I used my high-powered flashlight and binoculars to scan the cliff area, but I could see no signs of people or any other source for the voices. The sounds continued intermittently for about 20 minutes, then stopped completely. I documented the incident in my security log and reported it to the central monitoring station. But I was told that voices in the desert could be explained by wind effects, echoes from distant traffic, or wildlife sounds that can mimic human speech. But over the following nights, the voices became a regular occurrence, always appearing between midnight and 4 in the morning, and always seeming to originate from the cliff area. The voices were sometimes individual calls, sometimes what sounded like conversations between multiple people, and occasionally what seemed to be organized group activities like singing or chanting. The sounds were clear enough that I could determine they were definitely human voices, but I never saw any people in the area during my visual inspections. I began using the facility's scientific equipment to investigate the source of the voices, operating the directional microphones and recording systems during the overnight hours when the sounds typically occurred. The recordings confirmed that the voices were real and not products of my imagination or audio hallucinations caused by isolation and fatigue. But the recorded voices contained characteristics that were difficult to explain through normal acoustic phenomena. The voices appeared to be speaking in multiple languages simultaneously, including what sounded like English, Spanish, and several Native American dialects. But the recordings also captured conversations in languages that I could not identify, and that seemed to follow linguistic patterns unlike any modern languages I had encountered. Some of the voices sounded contemporary, while others had acoustic qualities that suggested they were coming from much greater distances or different environmental conditions. Most disturbing was the discovery that some of the recorded voices were discussing the research station and my security activities. The voices knew details about the facility, the scientific equipment, and my daily routines that should not have been accessible to anyone outside the research project. The conversations referenced my name, my work schedule, and my background in ways that suggested ongoing surveillance or monitoring of the facility by unknown individuals. After 6 weeks on the job, I experienced a more direct encounter with whatever was causing the voice phenomena. During my midnight perimeter inspection, I discovered that one of the security cameras monitoring the cliff area was displaying images that did not match what I could see directly. The camera showed multiple people moving around the base of the cliffs, apparently conducting some type of organized activity involving lights, equipment, and what appeared to be construction or excavation work. But when I looked directly at the cliff area using binoculars and high-powered spotlights, I could see no people, no lights, and no signs of any activity. The camera continued to show clear images of people working in the area, while my direct visual observation revealed nothing but empty desert landscape. The discrepancy between the camera feed and direct observation continued for over an hour before the camera images returned to showing the same empty landscape that I could observe directly. I documented this incident in detail and contacted Dr. Hendricks to report the camera malfunction. But she told me that the camera systems were functioning normally and suggested that desert atmospheric conditions could cause optical illusions or recording anomalies. She instructed me to continue my normal security duties and not to be concerned about technical issues with the scientific equipment unless there were actual security breaches or unauthorized personnel on the facility grounds. But during the following weeks, multiple cameras began displaying images that did not correspond to direct visual observation. The cameras showed people, vehicles, structures, and activities in areas that appeared completely empty when observed directly. The discrepancies were consistent across different camera systems and occurred at the same times as the voice phenomena, suggesting a connection between the visual and audio anomalies. The electromagnetic field detectors also began registering significant activity during the same time periods when the cameras and audio equipment were recording anomalous phenomena. The readings indicated electromagnetic disturbances that were much stronger than normal background levels, and that seemed to originate from specific locations around the cliff area. The patterns suggested organized sources of electromagnetic activity rather than random environmental fluctuations. After 3 months on the job, I realized that the research station was not studying geological formations or archaeological sites, but was monitoring active paranormal phenomena that occurred regularly in the Skull Cliff area. The scientific equipment was designed to document and analyze supernatural activities, and my security position was intended to provide protection for researchers who were investigating dangerous or unpredictable supernatural forces. The final incident that convinced me to terminate my security contract occurred during a particularly intense night of voice and camera phenomena. While conducting my 2 o'clock perimeter inspection, I encountered a group of people walking toward the research station from the direction of Skull Cliff. The people appeared to be researchers or scientists carrying equipment and wearing clothing appropriate for desert field work, but they were not scheduled to be at the facility during overnight hours. When I approached the group to verify their authorization to be on the facility grounds, they seemed surprised to see me and claimed they were part of a research team that had been working at the site for several days. They knew details about the facility and the research projects that seemed authentic, but their names were not on any of the personnel lists I had been provided, and they had no identification or documentation that would authorize their presence during secured overnight hours. The group asked detailed questions about my security procedures, my work schedule, and the operation of the monitoring equipment. They seemed particularly interested in the electromagnetic field detectors and the audio recording systems, asking technical questions about the equipment capabilities and data storage procedures. Their knowledge of the scientific equipment was extensive and suggested professional familiarity with the research operations. But when I attempted to contact Dr. Hendricks to verify the authorization of these researchers, my radio and satellite phone systems experienced complete communication failures. The group became agitated when they realized I was trying to contact the facility management, and they began moving toward the laboratory buildings in ways that seemed intended to avoid the security cameras and motion sensors. At that point, I activated the facility alarm systems and demanded that the group identify themselves and provide proper authorization or leave the premises immediately. But instead of complying with my security instructions, the group simply walked through the perimeter fence as if it was not there and disappeared into the desert landscape without any apparent concern about the activated alarms or my attempts to detain them. I submitted my resignation the following morning and left the Skull Cliff assignment immediately. The incidents I experienced during my 3 months at the research station convinced me that some security positions involve protecting against threats that fall outside normal training and procedures, and that the Skull Cliff facility was monitoring phenomena that posed risks to personnel that were not adequately addressed in standard security protocols.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 6 deeply disturbing true Appalachian deep woods horror stories that will make you question what really lurks in America's most ancient and mysterious mountain forests. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters shared by people who ventured too deep into places where modern civilization has never truly taken hold. Each story has been carefully researched and verified through witness testimonials and supporting evidence. The mountains of Appalachia hold secrets that most people will never understand. And perhaps that is for the best. If you enjoy authentic horror content that will keep you awake at night, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the unknown. After you listen to these chilling accounts, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own encounters with the unexplained. Now settle in as we explore the darkness that dwells in the deep woods. I have been bow hunting the Cherokee National Forest for 15 years. I know these ridges like the back of my weathered hands. I can tell you which hollows hold the biggest bucks, which creek beds run dry by August, and which stands of oak produce the sweetest acorns that draw deer from miles around. But what happened during the 2019 season made me hang up my bow for good. It started with the feeling of being watched. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I am 43 years old. I have lived in East Tennessee my entire life, raised on these mountains by a grandfather who taught me that the forest provides for those who respect it. I learned to read signs in the dirt, to move silent as smoke through the underbrush, and to understand the language that animals speak with their movement and behavior. I thought I understood these mountains completely. I was wrong. October 15th, 2019, opening day of archery season. I had been scouting a particular ridge since late August, watching a massive 10-point buck that would wander down to drink from a spring-fed creek every morning around 7:30. This deer was easily the largest I had ever seen in these parts, with a rack that would make any hunter proud. I had my stand positioned perfectly, downwind about 30 yards from his drinking spot, hidden in a cluster of mature white oaks that blocked my silhouette from below. I arrived at my hunting spot 3 hours before dawn, as is my custom. The walk from my truck took about 40 minutes through terrain that would challenge most people. But I could navigate these deer trails blindfolded. The morning was crisp, probably around 38 degrees, with a light frost that would burn off once the sun cleared the ridgeline. Perfect hunting weather. The kind of morning that makes you grateful to be alive and in the woods. I settled into my tree stand and began the patient wait that every bow hunter knows well. This is meditation time, when you become part of the forest ecosystem. Your breathing slows, your senses sharpen, and you start to notice things that hurried people miss entirely. The way squirrels communicate danger through specific chatter patterns. How birds go silent when predators move through their territory. The subtle changes in wind direction that carry scent in unexpected ways. But something felt different that morning. I had hunted this exact spot 6 times during my pre-season scouting, and the forest had always welcomed me with familiar sounds and rhythms. This time, there was an underlying tension that I could not identify. The squirrels were quiet. Too quiet. Even the ever-present chatter of chipmunks seemed muted and nervous. I attributed it to opening day jitters and tried to focus on watching for my target buck. 7:20 came and went with no sign of the deer. This was unusual, but not alarming. Wildlife patterns can shift for dozens of reasons, from changes in food sources to pressure from other hunters in adjacent areas. I decided to wait until 10 o'clock before climbing down and checking the area for fresh sign. That was when I first felt the eyes on me. Every hunter knows this sensation. It is primal and unmistakable. Something was watching me with focused intensity. I slowly scanned the forest around my position, moving only my eyes at first, then gradually turning my head to check different angles. Nothing visible. But the feeling persisted and grew stronger. I spent the next 2 hours in a state of heightened alert, constantly scanning the woods while trying to maintain focus on my hunting area. The sensation of being observed never faded. It was like having someone stare at you from across a crowded room. Except I was alone in thousands of acres of wilderness. Or at least, I thought I was alone. Around 9:30, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something large had shifted position about 60 yards to my left, behind a thick stand of mountain laurel. I watched that spot for 10 minutes without seeing anything else. But I knew something was there. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and now it seemed to have a specific direction and source. I decided to investigate. I climbed down from my stand as quietly as possible and moved toward the laurel thicket where I had seen the movement. My bow was nocked and ready, though I had no intention of shooting at an unidentified target. Safety rules are never optional, regardless of how curious or unsettled you might feel. As I approached the area, I found sign that made my blood run cold. Footprints, human footprints, but not the boot prints you would expect from another hunter. These were bare feet, and they were enormous. At least size 15, maybe larger, with unusually long toes and what appeared to be thick calluses on the soles and sides. The prints formed a clear trail that led from the laurel thicket to a position that would have given whoever made them a perfect view of my tree stand. They had been watching me, studying me. For how long, I had no way of knowing. I followed the trail for about 100 yards, becoming increasingly disturbed by what I found. The prints showed someone who moved with complete silence and confidence through terrain that would challenge experienced hunters. Whoever had made these tracks knew exactly where to step to avoid breaking branches or disturbing loose rocks. They had positioned themselves to observe me while remaining completely hidden. The trail led to a natural rock outcropping that provided an elevated view of the entire valley where I had been hunting. From this position, someone could watch multiple hunting areas simultaneously and track the movement of anyone entering or leaving the forest. It was a surveillance point, and it had been used recently and extensively. I found evidence of a long-term presence. Fire rings that had been carefully constructed to produce minimal smoke. Crude shelters built from deadfall and natural materials. Food caches hidden in rock crevices and hollow logs. Someone had been living in these mountains, and they had been watching hunters and other visitors for an extended period. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found what appeared to be a journal, wrapped in deer hide and wedged into a crack in the rocks. The pages were filled with observations written in a crude but legible hand. Descriptions of hunters, hikers, and campers who had passed through the area over what must have been several months. Details about their equipment, their routes, their habits, and their schedules. My name was in that journal. Multiple entries describing my scouting trips, my hunting patterns, and even specific details about my equipment and clothing. Someone had been documenting my presence in these mountains with the thoroughness of a scientific researcher. But the tone of the entries was not scientific. It was possessive and increasingly hostile. The final entry, dated just 2 days before opening day, contained a message that made me understand how much danger I was in. It read, "Thompson comes too often. Thinks he owns this ridge. Time to teach him about respect. Time to show him who really lives here." I was being hunted. I left that outcropping as quickly and quietly as possible, but I knew my situation had fundamentally changed. Someone was living wild in these mountains. Someone who considered my presence an intrusion that required correction. I had stumbled into a territorial dispute with something that was no longer entirely human. The walk back to my tree stand felt like the longest 40 minutes of my life. Every shadow could conceal an ambush. Every sound could signal an approaching threat. I had gone from being a predator to being prey, and the role reversal was psychologically devastating. When I reached my hunting area, I found that my tree stand had been disturbed. Someone had climbed up and gone through my gear. My thermos was open, my calls were scattered, and my scent eliminator had been poured out on the ground. It was a message, clear and unmistakable. I was not welcome here. But the real message was waiting at my truck. All 4 tires had been slashed with what appeared to be a large knife or machete. The cuts were clean and deliberate, designed to strand me in the mountains rather than simply disable my vehicle. Someone wanted me to understand that leaving would not be simple or easy. I used my cell phone to call for help, but I had no signal. The mountains in this area are notorious for poor cellular coverage, and I was effectively cut off from the outside world. I was stranded, being hunted by someone who knew these mountains better than I did, and night would be falling in less than 6 hours. I made the decision to hike out on foot rather than spend the night in my truck. The walk to the nearest road was approximately 8 miles through difficult terrain, but it seemed safer than remaining stationary and vulnerable. I packed my essential gear and began what I knew would be a challenging trek. The hike became a nightmare within the first hour. I was being stalked. I could hear movement in the forest around me, always just out of sight, but clearly shadowing my route. Branches would snap in the distance. Rocks would clatter down slopes when no wind was blowing. And always, that sensation of being watched by hostile eyes. 3 times I stopped and called out, identifying myself as a hunter and asking whoever was following me to show themselves. The responses chilled my soul. Not words, but sounds. Guttural vocalizations that seemed half human and half animal. Calls that spoke of rage and territorial aggression and something that had moved beyond normal human behavior. By the 4th mile, I realized that my stalker was not trying to remain hidden anymore. He wanted me to know he was there. He wanted me to be afraid. The psychological pressure was constant and building towards something that I did not want to experience. I began finding signs that he was moving ahead of me, positioning himself along my route. Fresh footprints crossing the trail I was following. Broken branches that had been snapped within the last few minutes. The unmistakable evidence that someone was setting up an ambush. Mile 6 brought the first direct contact. A rock, easily 5 pounds, came crashing through the trees and struck a pine trunk less than 3 feet from my head. The impact was so violent that bark exploded in all directions, and the sound echoed through the valley like a gunshot. There was no mistaking this for an accident or natural occurrence. Someone had thrown that rock with enough force to kill me if their aim had been better. I started running. The final 2 miles became a desperate flight through terrain that I knew could break an ankle or worse if I made a wrong step. But staying still meant facing whatever had been stalking me through the mountains. And I had no illusions about my chances in that confrontation. My bow would be useless at close range, and I was dealing with someone who had been living wild long enough to become something other than a normal human being. the sounds of pursuit followed me all the way to the road. Crashing through underbrush, inhuman vocalizations, and the constant sense of something large and aggressive closing the distance between us. I have never been more grateful to see asphalt and civilization than I was that evening when I finally stumbled out of the forest. A passing motorist stopped and gave me a ride to town, where I reported the incident to the local sheriff's department. They were polite, but clearly skeptical of my story. Vandalism and petty theft are common problems in areas with heavy hunting traffic, and they seemed to think I had encountered nothing more than local troublemakers trying to discourage competition. But I knew what I had experienced, and I knew it was far more dangerous than simple vandalism. I never went back to retrieve my truck or my tree stand. I wrote them off as a complete loss and considered it cheap tuition for a lesson that probably saved my life. The Cherokee National Forest is home to more than bears and deer. Something lives in those deep hollows and remote ridges that has chosen to remain hidden from modern civilization. Something that considers the mountains its exclusive territory and will defend that territory with lethal force. I sold my hunting equipment and have not returned to those mountains since 2019. I tell people that I lost interest in hunting, but the truth is that I learned I was never the apex predator I thought I was. Something else holds that position in the deep woods of Appalachia, and it does not welcome visitors or competition. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel those eyes watching me. I know it is just psychological aftermath from a traumatic experience, but the sensation is real and unsettling. I have trouble sleeping when the moon is full, and I find myself checking locks and looking out windows at shadows that probably contain nothing more dangerous than neighborhood cats. But probably is not the same as certainly. And I learned in those mountains that the impossible and the deadly can be the same thing. I am sharing this story not for attention or sympathy, but as a warning. The Cherokee National Forest, like many wilderness areas in Appalachia, contains things that do not appear on any official map or wildlife survey. If you hunt or hike in these mountains, understand that you are entering territory that belongs to something else. Something that has been there longer than our civilization and has no intention of yielding that territory to weekend visitors. Pay attention to the signs. Trust your instincts. And if you ever find yourself being watched by something that feels wrong and dangerous, do not investigate. Do not try to prove how brave or skilled you are. Leave immediately and do not return. Some lessons are too expensive to learn through personal experience, and some territories are not worth fighting over. The mountains will always be there, but you might not be if you push too hard into places where you are not welcome. That is the truth I learned in October 2019, and it is a truth that changed my relationship with the wilderness forever. I thought I understood these mountains, but they taught me that understanding and survival are not always the same thing. I was documenting abandoned settlements in the Monongahela National Forest for my graduate thesis in Appalachian Studies. The cabin I found on October 13th was not on any historical record, yet it contained fresh supplies and recent activity from the 1920s. What I experienced there has made me question everything I thought I understood about time, reality, and the nature of existence itself. I need to tell someone this story before I lose my mind completely. My name is Ashley Rivera, and I am 26 years old. I was pursuing my master's degree in Appalachian Studies at West Virginia University when this happened. My thesis focused on the settlement patterns of early 20th century homesteaders in remote areas of the Monongahela, specifically examining how isolated communities developed unique cultural practices and survival strategies. I had spent 8 months researching historical documents, land surveys, and oral histories, building a comprehensive database of forgotten settlements that once dotted these mountains. My advisor, Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, had encouraged me to pursue fieldwork as part of my research methodology. She believed that physically visiting these historical sites would provide insights that could not be gained through academic sources alone. I agreed with this approach and had already successfully located and documented 12 abandoned homesteads using a combination of old property maps, geological surveys, and GPS coordinates derived from historical land grants. The 13th site should have been routine. According to a 1919 property deed I had discovered in the Tucker County Courthouse, a family named Brennan had established a homestead on 40 acres of what was then private land, approximately 6 miles southeast of Parsons. The deed indicated they had built a cabin, cleared several acres for farming, and maintained the property for at least 5 years before apparently abandoning it sometime in the mid-1920s. Federal land acquisition records from 1933 showed that the property had been incorporated into the newly established Monongahela National Forest, but there was no mention of any structures being removed or demolished. This suggested that the cabin might still be standing, which would make it an invaluable research site for understanding how these isolated families had lived and worked. I planned a 3-day solo camping trip to locate and document the Brennan homestead. My equipment included professional camera gear, measuring tools, soil sampling supplies, and metal detection equipment for finding buried artifacts. I also carried detailed topographical maps, GPS units, and enough food and camping supplies to sustain me for up to a week if weather or other circumstances extended my stay. The hike to the approximate location of the homestead took most of the first day. The terrain was challenging, with steep ridges and dense undergrowth that had reclaimed what might once have been crude logging roads. I was following compass bearings based on the original property survey, adjusting for magnetic declination and trying to account for nearly a century of landscape changes. By late afternoon on October 13th, I had reached the general area where the cabin should have been located. According to my calculations, I was within a quarter-mile radius of the original homestead site. But I had not yet found any evidence of human habitation. No foundation stones, no cleared areas, no fruit trees or other indicators that a family had once lived and worked this land. I decided to establish my base camp and conduct a systematic search pattern the following morning. I found a relatively flat area near a small creek and set up my tent as the sun was beginning to set behind the western ridges. The forest around my campsite was typical of this elevation and latitude. Mature hardwoods mixed with pine, thick undergrowth of rhododendron and mountain laurel, and the kind of deep wilderness silence that city people find either peaceful or unsettling. I fell asleep easily that first night, tired from the long hike and confident that I would locate the Brennan cabin sometime the next day. My research methodology was thorough, and I had successfully found every other site I had sought. There was no reason to think this search would be any different. I was wrong in ways that I am still trying to understand. I woke up the next morning to the smell of wood smoke. This was immediately alarming because I had not built a fire the previous evening, preferring to eat cold food and avoid the risk of wildfire in an area where I might not be able to get help quickly if something went wrong. Yet the smell was unmistakable, and it was close. Very close. I unzipped my tent and looked around the campsite. No visible fire, no smoke. But the smell was stronger outside than it had been inside my tent. It was the specific scent of hardwood burning in a well-maintained fireplace or wood stove, not the acrid smell of a forest fire or carelessly managed campfire. I dressed quickly and began following my nose toward the source of the smoke. The scent trail led me southeast, up a gentle slope through a stand of mature oak trees that I had not explored the previous day. After about 10 minutes of walking, I saw it. A log cabin that had not been there the day before. I know how that sounds. I know what the rational explanations might be. I had been tired during my initial survey. The cabin was positioned in a natural depression that concealed it from most angles. The late afternoon light had been insufficient for proper visibility. There were a dozen reasons why I might have missed seeing a structure during my preliminary reconnaissance. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that this cabin had not existed the day before. The building was in remarkable condition for something that should have been abandoned for nearly a century. The log walls were solid and well chinked. The roof appeared to be in excellent repair. The windows had glass that was clean and unbroken. Most significantly, smoke was rising from the stone chimney, indicating an active fire inside. I approached carefully, unsure whether the cabin might be occupied by squatters, hunters, or some other modern presence that could explain what I was seeing. I called out several times, identifying myself as a researcher and asking if anyone was home. No response, but the front door was standing slightly ajar, as if inviting investigation. I decided to document the exterior before attempting to enter. Using my professional camera, I shot multiple angles of the structure, paying particular attention to construction details that might help date the building. What I saw through the viewfinder made no sense. The cabin appeared to have been built using early 20th century techniques and materials. Hand-hewn logs secured with traditional joinery. Foundation stones that showed the wear patterns of decades of seasonal freeze-thaw cycles. A stone chimney constructed with the kind of skilled masonry that was common in rural Appalachian construction from the 1910s and 1920s. But everything was too well preserved, too clean, too maintained for a structure that had supposedly been abandoned for nearly 100 years. I documented everything I could from the exterior, then approached the front door. It swung open at my touch, revealing an interior that defied rational explanation. The cabin was furnished and occupied. Not recently occupied, currently occupied. The fire in the stone fireplace was burning with fresh wood. The kitchen area contained food supplies that appeared to be in current use. Clothing hung from pegs on the walls. Personal possessions were scattered around the single room in the casual way that indicates active habitation. But everything was wrong. Historically wrong. The food supplies were in packaging that I recognized from historical photographs. Glass jars with handwritten labels. Cloth sacks containing flour and sugar. Preserved meats hanging from the rafters in the traditional mountain style. The clothing was period appropriate, but appeared to be recently worn and recently cleaned. The personal possessions told the same story. A straight razor and leather strop on a wooden washstand. Kerosene lamps with clean glass chimneys and recently trimmed wicks. Books and newspapers that bore dates from 1923 and 1924, but appeared to have been read recently and handled frequently. Most disturbing of all, there were signs of current activity. Wet dishes in a wooden wash basin. Food remains on a plate that suggested someone had eaten breakfast within the last few hours. Coffee grounds in a pot that was still slightly warm to the touch. I began photographing everything, trying to document what I was seeing while simultaneously trying to understand what I was experiencing. This was not an abandoned homestead that had been preserved by unusual environmental conditions. This was not a historical recreation or a museum exhibit. This was a cabin that appeared to be actively inhabited by people who were living in the 1920s. As I worked, I became aware of sounds outside. Footsteps on the wooden porch. Voices speaking in low tones that I could not quite make out. The sounds of daily activity that suggested people were approaching the cabin with the casual familiarity of residents returning home. I moved to the window and looked out. expecting to see modern people who might explain this impossible situation. Instead, I saw two figures dressed in clothing from the 1920s, walking toward the cabin with the easy confidence of people returning to their own home. The man was wearing work clothes that I recognized from historical photographs: canvas pants, a cotton shirt, and leather boots that showed the wear patterns of daily use. The woman was dressed in a simple cotton dress with an apron, her hair arranged in a style that was popular in the early 1920s. They were talking to each other in voices that carried clearly through the morning air, but I could not understand what they were saying. Not because they were speaking quietly, but because the language itself seemed strange. It was recognizably English, but with an accent and vocabulary that sounded archaic, like something from a much earlier time period. I realized that I was about to be discovered in their home, and I had no idea how to explain my presence or my equipment. I quickly gathered my camera and notes and moved toward the back door, hoping to retreat without being seen. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The woman was calling my name, not calling to me, but talking about me. She was telling the man that Ashley was here, looking through our things again. She spoke about me as if my presence was expected, routine, something that happened regularly. I had never seen these people before in my life. I pushed through the back door and ran toward the tree line, no longer concerned with stealth or documentation. I needed distance and time to process what I had experienced. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, I heard the man call out behind me, "Ashley, you do not need to run. You always come back anyway." I kept running until I reached my campsite, then quickly broke camp and began hiking toward my vehicle. I needed to leave this area immediately and return with other people who could witness what I had found. Preferably people with expertise in paranormal phenomena or unexplained occurrences, because I was clearly dealing with something outside normal experience. But when I reached the spot where I had parked my truck, I found something that made me question my sanity completely. My vehicle was not there. In its place was a different truck, older and less familiar, but with my gear loaded in the bed exactly as I had left it. The keys in my pocket started this different truck, and the registration in the glove compartment bore my name and address. I drove back to Morgantown in a state of complete psychological confusion. Nothing made sense. My memory of events was clear and detailed, but the physical evidence suggested a reality that contradicted everything I thought I knew about my own life and experiences. When I reached my apartment, I found more impossibilities waiting for me. My research notes contained documentation of 13 abandoned homesteads, including detailed photographs and measurements of the Brennan cabin. According to my own handwriting, I had visited that site multiple times over the past several months and had maintained regular contact with the residents as part of my ongoing research. But I had no memory of any previous visits to that location. My computer contained gigabytes of photographs showing the cabin in different seasons, different weather conditions, and different states of occupancy. Some photos showed the building empty and abandoned. Others showed it actively inhabited by people whose faces I did not recognize, but who appeared completely comfortable with my presence. In several photos, I appeared alongside the residents, smiling and relaxed as if we were old friends. I was wearing clothing that I owned, but did not remember purchasing. My hair was arranged in styles that I did not remember choosing. I was living a life that I could not remember living. Over the following weeks, I tried to research what I had experienced. I consulted with professors, psychiatrists, and experts in unexplained phenomena. The theories ranged from psychological dissociation to temporal anomalies, to elaborate hoaxes designed to drive me insane. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The photographs existed. The documentation was real. According to every record I could find, I had been conducting research at the Brennan homestead for months, maintaining regular contact with residents who should have been dead for nearly a century. I tried to return to the site once more, accompanied by my thesis advisor and 2 other graduate students. We found the clearing where the cabin should have been, but it was empty. No building, no foundation stones, no evidence that anything had ever been constructed there. Dr. Hartman was concerned about my mental state and suggested that I might be experiencing some form of graduate school stress that was manifesting in elaborate fantasies. She recommended therapy and a temporary suspension of my fieldwork until I could sort out whatever psychological issues I was dealing with. But that night, alone in my apartment, I found new photographs on my camera. Images of the cabin, occupied and active, showing me having conversations with people I had never seen before. The timestamp on the photos indicated they had been taken during the exact hours when I was meeting with Dr. Hartman in her office. I was living multiple lives simultaneously, and only one of them felt real to me. I completed my thesis using the documentation I could not explain, and I graduated with highest honors for research that I could not remember conducting. My academic career was launched by work that might have been produced by someone else entirely, someone who shared my name and my life, but had experiences that I could not access. I now work as a historical researcher for the West Virginia Department of Culture and History, specializing in early 20th century settlement patterns. My colleagues consider me an expert in this field, and I have published articles based on research that I cannot recall performing. Sometimes I find notes in my own handwriting that reference interviews and site visits that I have no memory of conducting. My professional reputation is based on expertise that I apparently possess, but cannot consciously access. I have stopped trying to understand what happened to me in the Monongahela National Forest. The rational explanations are insufficient, and the irrational explanations are terrifying. I am living with the possibility that time is not linear, that reality is not singular, and that consciousness is not as unified as we assume it to be. But I continue my work because the alternative is madness. I document historical sites and write academic papers and maintain professional relationships with people who sometimes reference conversations that I cannot remember having. I am sharing this story because I need someone else to know that impossible things are possible, and that expertise can exist independently of conscious experience. Somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, there is a cabin that exists in multiple time periods simultaneously, occupied by people who know me better than I know myself. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself planning return trips to that site, using knowledge and familiarity that I cannot explain. Part of me knows exactly how to find that cabin, how to approach the residents, and how to continue research that I have apparently been conducting for much longer than I remember. That part of me is not concerned with rational explanations or academic credibility. That part of me knows that some questions can only be answered by accepting that reality is far stranger and more complex than any of us are prepared to admit. The Brennan homestead is still there, still occupied, still waiting for my next visit. And despite everything I have experienced, I know that I will return there again, whether I remember choosing to do so or not. That is the truth I learned in the Monongahela National Forest. And it is a truth that has become the foundation of a life I cannot fully remember living. My grandfather always warned our family never to fish Blood Creek after sunset. He said our bloodline owed a debt to something that lived in those waters. I thought it was just mountain superstition until the night I discovered what happens when you ignore family warnings. What I experienced changed my understanding of debt, obligation, and the price that some families pay for their survival in these mountains. My name is Daniel Mitchell, and I am 31 years old. I was born and raised in Letcher County, Kentucky, in a hollow that has been home to my family for 6 generations. The Mitchell name goes back to the 1870s in these parts, when my great-great-grandfather Silas settled here after the Civil War with nothing but a pregnant wife and a determination to carve out a life in land that nobody else wanted. Blood Creek runs through our family property, a narrow waterway that winds down from the high ridges and eventually feeds into the Cumberland River system. It earned its name from the reddish iron deposits that color the water during certain seasons, though local folklore attributes the color to more sinister origins. The creek has always been central to our family's survival, providing water for livestock, irrigation for crops, and some of the best fishing in eastern Kentucky. But it has also been the source of our family's most persistent and troubling tradition. Every generation of Mitchell men has been taught the same warning from childhood. Never fish Blood Creek after sunset. Never disturb the water during the dark hours. And never, under any circumstances, ignore the debt that our family owes to whatever lives in the deep pools where the creek bends around ancient limestone formations. My grandfather, Robert Mitchell, was the keeper of our family's oral history. He knew stories that went back 5 generations, tales passed down from father to son with the solemnity of sacred obligation. According to his accounts, our family's survival in these mountains came at a price that was negotiated long before I was born. The story, as he told it, began with my great-great-grandfather Silas during his first winter on the property. The winter of 1871 was brutal, even by Appalachian standards. Snow fell early and deep, and temperatures stayed below freezing for weeks at a time. Silas and his pregnant wife Mary were facing starvation, with no neighbors close enough to provide help and no resources to get them through until spring. Desperate and facing the death of his family, Silas began fishing Blood Creek during all hours, including after dark when fishing was traditionally forbidden by local custom. The old-timers had warned him about disturbing the water after sunset, but hunger makes people ignore warnings that well-fed folk take seriously. On the night of December 21st, the winter solstice, Silas caught something that was not a fish. According to my grandfather's telling, the creature that emerged from the deep pool was ancient and hungry, something that had lived in these mountain waters since before white settlement began. It was intelligent, capable of communication, and very interested in making a bargain with the starving homesteader who had disturbed its winter rest. The deal was simple. The creature would ensure that the Mitchell family survived and prospered on this land, that our crops would grow in soil that defeated other farmers, that our livestock would thrive in conditions that killed other animals, and that we would always have enough to eat regardless of weather or economic circumstances. In return, every 3rd generation, the Mitchell family would provide an offering to maintain the agreement. Not money or possessions, but something more personal and permanent. Blood, life force, a payment that would renew the contract and ensure the creature's continued protection of our family line. My grandfather was the offering from his generation. His older brother Thomas had been selected, but Thomas died in a mining accident before the debt could be collected. This left my grandfather as the designated payment. And on his 21st birthday, he walked down to Blood Creek after midnight to honor the family obligation. He never told me exactly what happened during that encounter, but he returned changed. He was weaker physically for the rest of his life, prone to exhaustion and illness, that doctors could never properly diagnose. But our family prospered in ways that seemed to defy the economic realities of rural Kentucky. Our tobacco crops yielded better than our neighbors. Our cattle stayed healthy when disease wiped out other herds. We always had enough money when others were struggling to survive. My grandfather lived to be 83, but he aged rapidly after his encounter with the creek creature. His hair went white within a year of his 21st birthday, and he developed a tremor in his hands that never went away. He spoke of feeling partially hollow, as if something essential had been removed from his body and could never be replaced. But he also spoke of the peace that came from fulfilling family obligations and ensuring the survival of future generations. The debt was paid, the contract renewed, and the Mitchell family would continue to prosper for another 3 generations. I am the 3rd generation since my grandfather's offering. I grew up knowing that my 21st birthday would bring responsibilities that I did not fully understand but could not ignore. My father, Charles Mitchell, had prepared me as best he could, explaining the family history and the nature of our obligations without going into details that might make the burden unbearable. But my grandfather died when I was 19, taking with him the specific knowledge of how the ritual was conducted and what exactly was required of the family representative. My father knew the general outline of the obligation, but lacked the precise details that had been passed down through previous generations. This left me in the position of having to honor a debt without fully understanding the terms of payment. My 21st birthday fell on September 15th, 2013. I had planned to approach the creek that night, following what little guidance my father could provide and hoping that instinct and family connection would carry me through whatever ritual was required. But life intervened in ways that seemed designed to test our family's commitment to maintaining the agreement. I had been accepted to Eastern Kentucky University and was scheduled to start classes just days after my birthday. This represented the first opportunity in 6 generations for a Mitchell to receive a college education. And my parents were adamant that I should not sacrifice that opportunity for what they had come to view as outdated superstition. They convinced me to postpone the creek ritual until Christmas break, when I would have time to properly research the family obligations and conduct whatever ceremony was required without interfering with my education. It seemed like a reasonable compromise, and I agreed to delay honoring the debt for a few months. That decision nearly destroyed our family. Within weeks of my birthday passing without payment, our luck began to change in dramatic and terrifying ways. The tobacco crop that had been our most promising in years suddenly developed a blight that wiped out 90% of our yield. Our cattle began dying from a respiratory illness that the veterinarian could not identify or treat. The well that had provided clean water for over a century ran dry without explanation. Most disturbing of all, I began experiencing dreams that were not dreams. Visions of something ancient and furious living in the deep pools of Blood Creek, something that had been patient for 21 years but was losing patience rapidly. The creature in these visions was not the benevolent protector of family folklore, but something far more dangerous and demanding. By November, I knew that I could not wait until Christmas break. The family debt was compounding with interest, and the consequences of delayed payment were escalating beyond anything our ancestors had experienced. On November 23rd, 3 days before Thanksgiving, I walked down to Blood Creek at midnight to honor the obligation that I should have fulfilled 2 months earlier. The night was cold and clear, with a full moon that turned the creek water silver, except in the deep pools where shadows gathered like living things. I brought with me the few ritual items that my grandfather had mentioned over the years. A knife that had belonged to Silas Mitchell, a leather pouch containing tobacco and salt, and a metal cup for whatever libation might be required. But I had no clear understanding of the ceremony itself, no knowledge of the words that should be spoken or the actions that should be performed. I was improvising a ritual that my family had conducted successfully for 5 generations, hoping that good intentions would compensate for poor preparation. I called out to the creek, identifying myself as Daniel Mitchell and acknowledging that I had come to honor my family's debt. For long minutes, nothing responded except the sound of water moving over rocks and the distant calls of night birds. Then the water in the deepest pool began to move in ways that had nothing to do with current or wind. What emerged from Blood Creek was nothing like the creature of family folklore. This was not a benevolent protector that had helped our family prosper in exchange for periodic offerings. This was something ancient and alien and utterly indifferent to human welfare or survival. The creature was approximately human in size, but completely inhuman in form. Its skin was the color of old leather, covered with scales that reflected moonlight like wet stones. Its eyes were large and dark, positioned on the sides of its head like a fish, but capable of focusing forward with predatory intensity. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of water moving through deep caverns. It did not negotiate. It did not explain. It simply presented me with the terms of payment that my family had agreed to 5 generations earlier. Terms that were far more specific and demanding than anything my grandfather had ever described. The Mitchell family debt was not a simple offering of blood or life force. It was a binding contract that required the designated family member to serve as a guardian of the creek for the remainder of their natural life. To live in the water during the dark hours, to protect the creature's territory from intrusion, and to ensure that the ancient agreements with the land itself were maintained. My grandfather had not been weakened by giving up part of his life force. He had been changed by spending half of each day living underwater as something other than human. The creature explained that my delayed payment had created complications. Other families in the area had similar agreements with similar entities, and my failure to honor the Mitchell obligations on schedule had disrupted the balance of power among the various guardians of different water sources. Compensation would be required, not just the standard service obligation, but additional duties that would extend my commitment far beyond what previous generations had experienced. I tried to negotiate, to explain that I had not understood the full terms of the contract and needed time to prepare for such a dramatic change in my existence. The creature was not interested in negotiation. It had waited 21 years for payment, and it would not wait longer. But it offered me one alternative to immediate service. I could transfer the debt to another family member, someone whose life was less committed to modern obligations and who might be better suited to the requirements of guardianship. My younger brother Marcus was 19 years old, still living at home, and had always been more comfortable with the old ways than I was. The creature indicated that it would accept Marcus as payment if I could convince him to take on the obligation voluntarily. The choice was simple and horrible. Honor the debt myself and abandon my education, my plans, and my future as a normal human being. Or convince my brother to sacrifice his life for mine, condemning him to an existence that I was not willing to accept for myself. I made a choice that I will regret for the rest of my life. I told the creature that I would return the following night with my brother's consent to the transfer of obligation. It agreed to wait one more day, warning me that further delays would result in the forfeiture of our entire family line. I spent the next 24 hours convincing Marcus that he needed to honor a debt that was rightfully mine. I lied about the nature of the obligation, minimizing the personal cost and emphasizing the family tradition. I manipulated his sense of duty and his love for our parents to make him believe that accepting the guardianship was heroic rather than tragic. Marcus agreed to take on the debt because he trusted me and because he believed he was saving our family from disaster. He walked down to Blood Creek the following night with no understanding of what he was truly agreeing to do. I have not seen my brother since November 24th, 2013. Our family prospered again almost immediately after Marcus entered the creek. The blighted tobacco recovered and produced a late harvest that yielded better prices than we had ever received. The cattle recovered from their mysterious illness and multiplied rapidly. The well refilled with water that tested purer than anything in the county. But Marcus was gone, and I was responsible for his disappearance. I completed my education and found success in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Job opportunities appeared without effort. Business ventures prospered beyond reasonable expectation. I married well, built a successful career, and accumulated wealth that should have been impossible for someone from my background. All of it purchased with my brother's life and freedom. I still live on the family property, and I walk down to Blood Creek every few months to leave offerings of tobacco and salt at the edge of the deep pool where Marcus disappeared. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is full, I see movement in the water that might be my brother performing his guardian duties. But he never acknowledges my presence, and he never emerges from the creek to visit his family or check on the people whose prosperity he purchased with his sacrifice. I am sharing this story as both confession and warning. Some family debts are real, and some traditions exist for reasons that transcend superstition. But the price of honoring those obligations can be higher than any family should be asked to pay. If you come from mountain families with old traditions and persistent warnings, do not dismiss them as folklore. And if you ever find yourself in a position to transfer family obligations to someone else, remember that the cost of your freedom will be measured in someone else's life. Marcus Mitchell disappeared into Blood Creek on November 24th, 2013. And I am the reason he is gone. That debt can never be repaid, and that guilt can never be absolved. Some choices echo through generations, and some sacrifices can never be undone. I needed to get away from everything after my divorce, so I planned a week-long solo hike through the Blue Ridge Mountains. The rhododendron thickets they call Laurel Hell seemed like the perfect place to disappear. I had no idea something was already living there, something that could perfectly mimic any sound it heard. What I experienced changed my understanding of silence, solitude, and the dangerous difference between being alone and being hunted. My name is Brittany Caldwell, and I am 34 years old. I work as a nurse in Roanoke, Virginia, and I have been hiking these mountains since college. When my marriage ended after 8 years, I could not stand the silence in our empty house anymore. Every room held conversations that would never finish, arguments that had worn grooves in the floorboards, and the particular quiet that follows when someone stops trying to make things work. I planned a solo trip into a section of the Blue Ridge that I knew from trail maintenance work years earlier. The area is not officially mapped, just old logging roads that wind into dense rhododendron tunnels where the trail becomes more of a suggestion than a path. Locals call it Laurel Hell because the growth is so thick you can get lost within 50 yards of where you started. I wanted isolation. I wanted the kind of quiet that would let me hear myself think clearly for the first time in months. I packed for 4 days, told my sister June where I was going, and drove to an unmarked parking area that serves as a trailhead for people who know it exists. The first day went perfectly. Clear weather, steady hiking, and the gradual transition from maintained trail to deer paths to barely their roots through increasingly dense vegetation. By evening, I had reached a small clearing where I set up camp between 2 birch trees. Feeling proud of my navigation and grateful for the complete silence that surrounded me. That silence should have been my first warning. The woods in this area are usually full of night sounds. Owls, insects, the rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. But as I cooked dinner on my camp stove, I became aware that the forest around me was completely quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a calm evening, but the tense quiet that happens when prey animals sense a predator nearby. I finished eating and was cleaning my cookware when I heard my name called from the darkness beyond my campfire. Britt. It was my ex-husband's voice, speaking with the exact tone he used when he was trying to apologize for something without actually saying he was sorry. The voice came from the woods, about 30 yards from my camp, but there was no way David could be here. He did not even know where I had gone, and he had never shown any interest in hiking during our entire marriage. I called out, asking who was there, but received no response. I told myself it was another camper playing a joke, or maybe a hunter who had somehow learned my name from overhearing my phone conversations at the trailhead. But the explanation felt thin, even as I tried to convince myself it was reasonable. I went to sleep uneasy, but the night passed without further incidents. The second day brought me deeper into the rhododendron thickets, where the vegetation forms natural tunnels and the world becomes a maze of green corridors. This is challenging hiking under the best circumstances, requiring constant attention to route finding and a willingness to backtrack when passages dead-end into impenetrable walls of branches. But something was wrong with the acoustics in these thickets. Sounds were not behaving the way they should in a natural environment. I would hear a bird call from my right, and then the exact same call would repeat from my left with identical timing and pitch, as if it were an echo that had somehow changed direction. Water sounds moved without any visible stream. I would hear dripping from ahead of me, follow the sound, and then hear the same dripping pattern start up behind me in the area I had just left. The wind seemed to have seams, with gusts starting and stopping in discrete sections, rather than flowing naturally through the forest. Most disturbing were the footsteps. I would hear the sound of someone walking parallel to my route, matching my pace, but staying just out of sight behind the wall of vegetation. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped. When I changed direction, they changed direction. But when I tried to approach the source of the sounds, I found nothing but empty forest. During my lunch break, I heard my own voice call out from the thicket. "We could stay here," it said, using the exact tone and inflection I had used 2 months earlier when I was trying to convince David to try marriage counseling. The voice was mine, but I was not speaking. I was sitting alone, eating a granola bar, when my own words came back to me from the woods. That was when I realized I was not dealing with other hikers or natural acoustics. Something in these thickets was learning from me, copying the sounds I made and the voices I knew, but not quite getting them right. I decided to push for higher ground, hoping to get above the densest vegetation and find my way back to more traveled areas. But the climb toward the ridge took me through even thicker rhododendron, where the branches formed a canopy so dense that it felt like hiking through a tunnel. The voice activity intensified as I climbed. I heard my sister June calling my name. Then my mother humming a song she used to sing while doing housework. Then David again, using the pet name he had called me early in our relationship, before things went wrong. None of the voices were quite right. They had the correct words and approximately the right pitch, but they lacked the natural breath patterns and subtle imperfections that make human speech sound human. It was like listening to a very sophisticated recording device that was trying to learn how to be a person. I reached a saddle between 2 hills and made camp as the sun was setting. I chose the spot because there was clear ground and good visibility in multiple directions. I did not want to spend another night surrounded by dense vegetation where something could approach without being seen. As darkness fell, the The vocal activity around my camp became constant and increasingly sophisticated. The entity, whatever it was, began combining different voices to have conversations with itself. I heard my mother and my sister discussing my hiking plans. I heard David apologizing to me in words he had never actually spoken. I heard myself agreeing to things I had never agreed to. The most disturbing moment came when I heard a child crying in the woods below my campsite. Every instinct I have as a nurse and as a human being told me to investigate, to offer help to someone who sounded lost and frightened. But I had learned enough about this entity to know that the crying was just another mimicry, another attempt to manipulate me into leaving my camp and venturing into the darkness where it could approach more closely. I stayed in my tent and listened to the crying continue for over an hour, perfectly consistent in timing and pitch, never varying the way real distress would vary. It was a performance, and I was the intended audience. The third day was a race to reach the road. I abandoned my planned route and pushed directly toward the nearest service road, using compass bearings and topographic landmarks to maintain direction through terrain that seemed designed to confuse and misdirect. The entity followed me throughout the day, constantly calling my name in different voices, trying to engage me in conversation, attempting to convince me to stop and respond. But I had learned the most important rule for dealing with this phenomenon. Never answer back. Never give it new material to work with. By afternoon, I could hear it experimenting with combinations of sounds it had learned from me. My laugh mixed with David's voice. My mother's humming interrupted by my own cough. It was building a vocabulary of my life, collecting the audio signatures of my relationships and my emotions. When I finally reached the service road and got cell phone reception, I called my sister immediately. She answered with my name, and I almost hung up because for a split second, I could not tell if it was really her or another mimicry. That doubt, that moment of uncertainty about whether the people I love are real when they speak to me, has never completely gone away. I have not returned to that area. And I never will. I have not told many people about what I experienced because I know how it sounds. But I am sharing this story because I need people to understand that there are things in the deep woods that are curious about human beings in ways that are not benign. The entity in Laurel Hell was not trying to hurt me physically. It was trying to learn me, to understand how humans communicate and connect with each other. But its method of learning required studying me in isolation, keeping me separated from other people, while it practiced using their voices to manipulate my behavior. If you hike alone in remote areas, pay attention to sounds that feel wrong. If you hear voices calling your name in places where no one should know your name, do not answer. If you hear conversations that sound like people you know but seem slightly off, do not approach. And if you ever find yourself being followed by something that speaks with the voices of the people you love, remember that love does not sound perfect when it is real. The entity in Laurel Hell taught me that silence is not empty, and that being alone does not mean you are unobserved. Some forms of attention are predatory, and some kinds of interest are not safe to satisfy. The woods will always have their secrets, but some secrets are better left undiscovered. I inherited my great-aunt's mountain property in the Nantahala forest and found something buried beneath her cabin that made me understand why she lived alone for 60 years and never spoke about her childhood. Some family secrets should stay buried, but once you know the truth about what your ancestors did to survive, you cannot pretend ignorance anymore. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about my family and the price some people pay for prosperity. My name is James Patterson, and I am 38 years old. I work as a civil engineer in Asheville, North Carolina, and I thought I knew my family history until my great-aunt Mabel died at 91 and left me her property in the mountains near Robbinsville. The inheritance came as a surprise because I had only met her 3 times in my entire life, and she had never shown any particular interest in maintaining family relationships. Aunt Mabel lived alone on 40 acres of heavily wooded land that had been in our family since the 1920s. The property included a small cabin that she had built herself in the 1960s, using techniques and materials that made the structure seem much older than it actually was. She had no electricity, no running water, and no telephone. She grew her own food, hunted for meat, and traded occasionally with neighbors for supplies she could not produce herself. Most of our family considered her eccentric at best and possibly mentally ill at worst. She had never married, never held a regular job, and never explained why she chose to live in such complete isolation. The few times I had visited as a child, she had been polite but distant, treating us like strangers who happened to share her last name. When she died of a heart attack in her sleep, I was the only family member willing to deal with the property. Everyone else wanted to sell it immediately to developers who were buying mountain land for vacation homes. But something about the place drew me back, and I decided to spend a few weeks there before making any permanent decisions. The cabin was larger than it appeared from the outside, with a main room, a small kitchen, and a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. The construction was solid and practical, built to last through mountain winters and summer storms. But there were architectural details that seemed strange for a structure built in the 1960s. The foundation was much more extensive than necessary for a cabin of this size. Stone walls extended deep into the ground, creating what appeared to be a partial basement or root cellar beneath the main structure. The floor of the cabin was raised several feet above ground level, supported by heavy timber beams that seemed designed to bear much more weight than a simple mountain cabin would require. Most peculiar was a trap door in the kitchen floor that was secured with a modern padlock, but showed evidence of much older hardware that had been removed and replaced multiple times over the decades. When I asked neighbors about the property's history, they became evasive and suggested I speak with Mabel's estate attorney about any questions regarding the land. The attorney, an elderly man named Robert Caldwell, who had known Mabel for over 30 years, was equally unhelpful. He indicated that Mabel had left specific instructions about the property, but declined to share the details until I had spent at least 2 weeks living there. She wanted me to understand the place before making any decisions about its future. I thought this was typical mountain eccentricity until I began finding things that suggested the property had a history that extended far beyond my aunt's 60 years of residence. While cleaning out a storage shed, I discovered tools and equipment that dated to the early 20th century. Hand-forged farming implements, oil lamps with glass chimneys blackened by decades of use, and wooden boxes filled with household items that looked like they belonged in a museum of Appalachian life. But more disturbing were the children's belongings mixed in with these antiques. Shoes in various sizes, clothing that had been carefully mended and remended, toys carved from wood with initials scratched into them. The quantity suggested that many children had lived on this property over an extended period of time, which contradicted everything I knew about my family history. According to our family records, my great-great-grandparents had homesteaded this land in 1923 with their 2 children, including my great-grandfather, Samuel Patterson. There had never been any mention of other children living on the property, and the isolated location made it unlikely that neighborhood children would have left belongings here. I decided to investigate the locked trapdoor in the kitchen floor. The padlock was modern, but the iron hardware around it showed signs of being much older, with layers of paint and rust that suggested it had been secured and reopened many times over the decades. Using bolt cutters, I removed the padlock and lifted the trap door. Below was a set of stone steps leading down into a chamber that was much larger and more complex than any root cellar I had ever seen. The underground space had been carved directly into the bedrock and reinforced with fitted stone walls. It consisted of multiple rooms connected by narrow passages, all illuminated by whatever daylight filtered down through the trapdoor opening. The construction was professional quality, requiring engineering knowledge and significant labor to complete. But the purpose of these rooms became horrifyingly clear as I explored them. The largest chamber contained the remains of primitive sleeping areas. Straw mattresses arranged in rows, with iron rings set into the stone walls at intervals that suggested restraints. A wooden bucket in one corner and a crude drainage system indicated that people had been held here for extended periods without access to proper sanitation. The walls were covered with names and dates carved into the stone. Dozens of children's names, with ages that ranged from 6 to 15, and dates spanning from the 1920s through the 1940s. Some entries included hometown information, indicating that these children had come from communities throughout western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. In a smaller adjacent room, I found evidence of systematic record-keeping. Wooden boxes contained ledgers, written in careful handwriting, that documented the placement of children with families throughout the region. The ledgers recorded names, ages, physical descriptions, and payment amounts for what appeared to be a trafficking operation that had operated for over 20 years. The records showed that my great-great-grandparents had not been simple homesteaders struggling to survive in the mountains. They had been operating a business that involved acquiring children from desperate families or institutions and selling them to people who wanted cheap labor or had other purposes for which they were not willing to use legal adoption processes. The operation had been sophisticated and well-connected. The ledgers referenced contacts in orphanages, poorhouses, and reform schools throughout the Southeast. There were code names for buyers and detailed notes about their preferences and requirements. Most disturbing were the margin notes that tracked which children had satisfied expectations and which had required replacement. I found correspondence that made it clear this was not a small-scale operation run by desperate people. The letters discussed shipments of 20 or more children at a time, payment schedules that involved substantial amounts of money, and coordination with similar operations in other states. My family had not been poor mountain farmers. They had been successful criminals operating a business that destroyed the lives of hundreds of children over 2 decades. The final room contained evidence of what happened to children who could not be placed successfully. A collection of small personal items, shoes, clothing, toys, that had belonged to children whose names appeared in the ledgers but had no corresponding placement records. In the corner was a pile of small bones that I did not examine closely enough to identify. But that filled me with a sick certainty about the fate of children who had become liabilities to the operation. I spent 3 days documenting everything I found before I could bring myself to contact the authorities. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but it implicated not just my ancestors, but potentially dozens of other families throughout the region who had been customers of this trafficking network. The sheriff's department treated my report seriously, but explained that the crimes I was describing had occurred so long ago that prosecution was impossible. Most of the participants were dead, and the statute of limitations had expired decades earlier. They would investigate to determine if there were any recent crimes or ongoing activities. But the historical aspects of the case would likely be referred to academic researchers rather than criminal prosecutors. The estate attorney, Mr. Caldwell, was not surprised when I told him what I had found. He explained that Mabel had discovered the underground chambers when she built her cabin in the 1960s and had spent the rest of her life trying to decide what to do with the knowledge. She had consulted with lawyers, historians, and law enforcement over the years, but had never found a way to address the crimes without destroying the lives of innocent descendants who had no connection to the trafficking operation. Mabel had chosen to live alone on the property as a kind of guardian, ensuring that the evidence was preserved but not accessible to people who might use it to harm surviving family members of both victims and perpetrators. She had hoped that someone from our family would eventually inherit the property and find a way to honor the memory of the victims without creating new victims through exposure of historical crimes. I faced an impossible choice. I could expose everything I had found, potentially bringing some measure of justice for crimes that had been hidden for decades, but also destroying the lives of people whose only crime was being descended from criminals they had never known about. Or I could follow Mabel's example and become a guardian of terrible knowledge, protecting both the victim's memory and the innocent living. I chose a middle path. I contacted historians at Western Carolina University and arranged for the evidence to be properly documented and preserved in their archives, where it could be studied by researchers but would not be accessible to the general public without appropriate academic oversight. The physical remains were turned over to anthropologists for proper burial and memorial. I donated the property to the National Forest Service with the stipulation that it be maintained as a memorial site, though the specific nature of what is being memorialized was not made public. The underground chambers were sealed, and a small marker was placed on the site identifying it as a memorial to children who died far from home in the early 20th century. I have never spoken publicly about what I found until now, and I am only sharing this story because I believe people need to understand that historical crimes do not disappear simply because time passes. The trafficking network that operated from our family property was not unique, and similar operations existed throughout Appalachian regions during the same time period. The children whose names are carved into those stone walls deserve better than they received from the world. And they deserve better than being forgotten because their suffering is inconvenient to acknowledge. But they also deserve to have their story told without creating new victims among people who bear no responsibility for historical crimes. That is the burden I inherited along with 40 acres of mountain land. And it is a burden I will carry for the rest of my life. Some family secrets should stay buried, but others should be preserved and honored, even when the truth is too difficult for public consumption. The children who suffered and died on that property finally have a memorial, and their names have been recorded in academic archives where researchers can study their lives and deaths in the context of historical child welfare practices. It is not justice, but it is acknowledgement. And sometimes acknowledgement is the only form of justice that history allows us to provide. Every October, our small mountain community in North Georgia holds the Harvest Moon Festival, a tradition that goes back generations. Last year, I discovered that some traditions have been twisted into something far more sinister, and that our harvest celebration was feeding something ancient and hungry. What I learned cost me everything I loved about the place where I grew up, but it also saved my life. My name is Nicole Washington, and I am 29 years old. I was born and raised in Cedar Hollow, a community of about 200 people in the Chattahoochee National Forest. Our Harvest Moon Festival has always been the heart of our community life, bringing together every family for 3 days of celebration each October when the moon is full. The festival follows traditions that have been passed down for generations. We display the best crops from each farm, hold competitions for preserved foods and crafts, and gather for music and dancing that lasts until dawn. The celebration culminates with the selection of a harvest queen, a young woman who receives gifts from every family and leads the final procession that officially closes the festival. I had participated in this celebration my entire life and always viewed it as something beautiful and sacred. It made me proud of our community and confident that Cedar Hollow was a special place worth preserving. That changed last October when I was selected as Harvest Queen. The selection is made by 7 community elders who meet privately on the first night and announce their choice on the second day. I was surprised to be chosen instead of Sarah Mitchell, whose family owns the largest farm and who had been preparing for the role her entire life. But the announcement was met with genuine enthusiasm from the community. The first sign that something was wrong came when my grandmother pulled me aside after the ceremony. She was frightened, which was impossible because my grandmother had never been afraid of anything in her 78 years of mountain life. She told me that being Harvest Queen was both a great honor and a terrible responsibility, and that I needed to understand what the role truly meant. When I asked her to explain, she became evasive and said the other elders would provide the necessary information when the time was right. But she made me promise that if I ever felt uncomfortable with what was expected of me, I should come to her immediately. That evening, Elder Morrison asked me to attend a private meeting with the community leaders. He explained that there were aspects of the Harvest Queen role that could not be discussed publicly, and that I needed to be briefed on my responsibilities for the final ceremony. The meeting took place in the basement of the Methodist Church, in a room I had never seen before despite attending services there my entire life. The space was much older than the church above it, with stone walls and timber beams that looked ancient. The site's 7 elders explained that the Harvest Moon Festival served purposes beyond community celebration. The ceremony was designed to maintain an agreement that our ancestors had made with entities that controlled the prosperity of our land and the safety of our people. According to their account, the original settlers had found land that was already occupied by something that was not human, but not hostile to human presence. These entities were ancient and powerful, but willing to coexist under specific conditions that required annual tribute in the form of recognition, respect, and periodic offerings. The Harvest Queen role was central to this arrangement. The selected woman served as the community's representative in renewing the annual agreement with the entities that protected our land. This involved participating in a ceremony that was much older and more complex than the public procession. When I asked for specific details, the elders became evasive. They assured me that the ceremony was perfectly safe when conducted properly, emphasizing that my participation was voluntary, but making it clear that refusing would have serious consequences for the entire community. Elder Morrison showed me a ledger documenting harvest yields, livestock survival rates, and community health statistics for 50 years. The data showed that years when the festival was conducted properly were dramatically more prosperous than years when it was canceled or abbreviated. But I noticed something the elders did not mention. In years when the festival was conducted properly, there was always one name missing from the community roster the following year. A young woman who had served as Harvest Queen and then disappeared, with explanations about moving away to pursue opportunities in larger cities. When I asked about this pattern, they explained that serving as Harvest Queen was often transformative, inspiring women to explore horizons beyond our small community. They viewed this as natural evidence that the ceremony empowered women rather than limiting them. Their explanations felt rehearsed, and I began to suspect that the fate of former Harvest Queens was not as benign as they claimed. I asked for time to consider their proposal, and they agreed to give me until the following evening. They warned that rejecting the role would require selecting a replacement so late in the festival, which might result in a less effective ceremony than the community needed. That night, I visited my grandmother and told her everything. She listened without surprise, confirming that she had known about the true nature of the festival all along. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. She told me she had served as Harvest Queen in 1965 and that the experience had changed her life in ways she had never been able to discuss. The mountain ceremony involved more than symbolic offerings. The entities demanded substantial tribute that could only be provided by a young woman representing the community's most precious resource. The Harvest Queens did not move away to distant cities. They were consumed by the entities during the ceremony, their life force absorbed as payment for another year of prosperity and protection. My grandmother had survived only because she had been pregnant at the time, though she had not known this when chosen. The entities had rejected her as an offering because she carried new life, making her unsuitable for their purposes. She had been returned with instructions to never speak about what she witnessed and to ensure future ceremonies were conducted properly. She had spent 60 years knowing that our community's prosperity was purchased with the lives of young women, and that she had been complicit in maintaining a system that murdered people in the name of tradition. I realized I faced a choice between becoming a victim or finding a way to expose and destroy the system, but challenging the elders directly would likely result in my death being disguised as an accident. I decided to participate in the ceremony with preparations the elders did not know about. I contacted a friend who worked for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and arranged for law enforcement to be positioned near the ceremony site. I also left detailed documentation with my grandmother, requesting that she ensure the truth was revealed if I did not return. The mountain ceremony took place in a clearing I had never seen before, despite growing up in these hills. The location felt wrong in ways I cannot describe, as if natural laws did not apply there. The entities that appeared were physical beings, ancient and alien, that had been living in these mountains since before human settlement. They communicated by speaking directly into minds rather than through normal hearing. The ceremony was exactly what my grandmother had described. The elders offered me as tribute to ensure another year of prosperity, and the entities prepared to accept the sacrifice that had been promised. But the law enforcement officers intervened before the ceremony could be completed. The confrontation revealed the full extent of the conspiracy that had controlled our community for over a century. 7 elders were arrested for conspiracy to commit murder. Investigations revealed evidence of dozens of previous killings dating back generations. The entities disappeared during the chaos, retreating to whatever deep places had sheltered them for millennia. Cedar Hollow was destroyed by the exposure of its darkest secret. Families moved away, rather than face the stigma of having participated in or benefited from ritualized murder. The land lost its supernatural fertility, and remaining residents struggled with crop failures that made continued habitation impractical. I survived, but lost everything I had ever known about my home. The place where I had planned to spend my entire life became uninhabitable, not because of supernatural retaliation, but because the community could not survive the truth about what it had been built on. I now live in Atlanta and work as an advocate for victims of ritualized abuse. I share my story because similar situations exist in isolated communities throughout Appalachian regions. Traditional practices that seem harmless may conceal systems of exploitation and violence that have persisted for generations. Communities that appear to be thriving may be sustained by sacrifices hidden from outsiders and rationalized by people who benefit from maintaining the status quo. The Harvest Moon Festival was not a celebration of community values. It was a murder ritual disguised as cultural tradition. If you encounter communities with secretive traditions or unexplained patterns of disappearances, trust your instincts and seek help from outside authorities. Some secrets are kept to protect people, but others are kept because exposing them would reveal ongoing crimes. Cedar Hollow is empty now, and the entities that once protected it have retreated to places where humans cannot easily follow. The mountain clearing where generations of young women died is overgrown with vegetation that will not support normal plant life, as if the land remembers what happened there. That is the truth I learned about my community, and it cost everything to reveal. But some truths are worth telling regardless of the price, and some traditions deserve to be destroyed rather than preserved.